to move the motion.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Sir George, I'd like to begin every Petitions Committee debate, this one, as I've begun every Petitions Committee debate I have led, by going over the prayer of this petition before I'd like to make just a few observations. So formally, on behalf of the Petitions Committee, I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 327108, entitled Reform the Gender Recognition Act. The prayer of this petition states, and I quote, "Reform the GRA to allow transgender people to self-identify without the need for a medical diagnosis, to streamline the administrative process, and to allow non-binary identities to be legally recognised." The response gathered from government showed strong support for this reform, with 70% in favour, but the result seems to have been largely ignored by policymakers. The current process is distressing and often humiliating for transgender people. As well as lengthy and costly, it makes it inaccessible to many people. Reform is needed to improve the lives of trans people, and I don't think that the proposed measures will negatively impact existing provisions under the Equalities Act. The petition closed with 137,271 signatures, including 224 from my own Carshalton and Wallington constituency. Now, Sir George, I do have a speech to make about the specific asks within the petition, but I did just want to make a few remarks before I do, because there is no denying that this petition, and indeed this debate, has been followed with great interest across the country, as indeed has the issue of trans rights more widely. The debate is one that has raged not just in this country, but across much of the world, and sadly, it has not been conducted in a well-mannered or a well-reasoned way. The discussion around trans people has become so toxic that it is frightening people from engaging with it. And indeed, when the Petitions Committee tried to schedule this debate, it was actually quite difficult to find a member who would agree to take it on for fear of what might happen on social media should they do so. To an outsider looking in, it may look like the debate around trans issues is one where you can only have one of two quite extreme points of view. And we've seen the most appalling, dreadful things said on both sides of this debate, with threats, intimidation and venom spat at either side. And there has been a failure to conduct this in a civilised and respectful way. And I want to be very clear that I believe that this failure lands squarely at our doors. It's the failure of MPs, it's the failure of leaders, it's the failure of the media, it's the failure of academia and beyond to make space for a respectful, real and genuine discussion. I will.
Doesn't you agree with me that one of the reasons why MPs are afraid to engage in this debate is because if they, as I have done so, they receive death threats, and in my case, a threat of corrective rape from a member of my own party?
I do completely agree with the Honourable Lady, and just to continue the remarks I was making, we have failed to make a genuine space to express concerns and come to an understanding with one another. And this has left a vacuum, because in that space, where the few people making their voices heard are those who want to pull us into one of two very extreme positions, we are left with only one of two options if you want to engage with this debate. Either it seems you must agree that to be trans isn't right or even real, that trans people are inherently dangerous and need curing rather than support, or on the other side, using trans people as an example of why the entire Western liberal system is wrong and that no one can be truly equal until the very foundations of what we understand about society are broken down. And the failure to have a real discussion has consequences for us all. We now have a situation where people do fear speaking up and fear to ask questions in case they get attacked or targeted. And there are, of course, strongly held views on both sides. But to shut down debate and to say that every single person must agree with our own worldview or else is damaging to society and poisons the debate. Because one of the most common things I hear from colleagues in this place, and I'm sure colleagues would agree with me on this, that the majority of colleagues I speak to simply say to me that they just don't know enough about the issue. They've not really given much thought to the reform of the Gender Recognition Act before. As far as they know, they've never met a trans person in their life, and that's fine. That's completely fine, but it therefore falls on us when we're bringing these discussions to a national platform to allow space for that discussion to happen so we can explore and ask questions. I would gladly give way.
As us in this room as legislators, would you not agree that, particularly when we're talking about some of the most marginalised people in society, that we have a job to educate ourselves? In the actual fact, we've had 5 years to educate ourselves.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I do agree. I think I'm going to come on to some points that she probably was leading me towards, so I'll make a bit of progress if colleagues will allow me. If we allow this toxicity to continue and we refuse to lead from the front, we will end up in the situation that we are in now, with having ridiculous public conversations about erasing language or trying to figure out if some certain words are offensive, and labelling anyone who expresses concerns about the protection of sex-based rights as TERFs or transphobic, rather than actually talking about the issues. We abdicate our responsibility as a House. But most importantly, what we forget, if we allow that to continue, are the people in the middle of all of this, are the hundreds of thousands of trans people living within the UK today who, like the majority of us, just want to live their lives. They don't want to have this massive toxic debate going on about their existence. They just want to be able to live their lives. So I plead with colleagues here today, and I urge them to use this debate today as an opportunity to change that narrative. Let's lead from the front. Let's have a more respectful discussion and debate with one another and explore these issues without the need to rip each other's throats out. Because I know from looking around the room today that there are very strongly held views on both sides of this discussion. And colleagues will no doubt want to reference and focus on appalling things that have been said and done on both sides of this debate and talk about some of the more nasty and absurd parts of the far ends of this debate. But I urge colleagues to just take a moment. People would say that this House is at its best when we come together in total agreement on an issue and we get this thing done. But I'd like to go a bit further. I genuinely believe that this House can demonstrate its strength, and indeed the very strength of the democratic process, when we can come together on an issue where there isn't agreement and yet find space to talk about that respectfully and find a way forward. I think that really does demonstrate the best of what this House can do, and I hope today we can have that opportunity, because we don't do ourselves any favours in taking the easy road and just appealing to those that we think are shouting the loudest. So please, colleagues, join me in rejecting this almost Twitterisation of this debate, where our arguments are condensed down to miniature sound bites, and we can really try and find the answers and find a way forward together, rather than tearing each other apart. I would happily give way, yeah.
An important, thank you for giving way, an important argument to frame the nature of the debate. But would you also agree that sometimes it's important that we don't talk in big grand narratives of our political beliefs one way or another? This debate is very specifically about the GRA and the process of applying and getting a GRC. And so actually colleagues shouldn't be having these big grand debates about trans, feminism, etc. We should be talking about the practical thing that the GRA and GRC does, which is only two very practical things, nothing else. It doesn't give you the rights for all other things, it only gives you two things it changes, your birth certificate and pension rights. And therefore we should limit the debate here on that, and that will provide civility.
The Honourable Member has second-guessed what I'm about to just move on to, so that I thank him for that intervention, because I truly do believe that there is a way forward for this House to come together on this, because as a member of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, which conducted a very recent inquiry on reform of the GRA, I was actually very struck at how much agreement there was on both sides of the debate on many of the practical issues that this petition is calling for, and a repetition of the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town, specifically on the issue of the application process for a GRC. And after all, that is what this petition is all about, because much of the discussion has indeed centred around access to things like single-sex spaces. But those, of course, aren't catered for in the GRA, nor indeed included in the scope of this petition. They are instead governed by the Equality Act, which sets out provisions around single-sex spaces. But it is quite right that we also do make space for that discussion to happen, because indeed part of the reason the debate has become so toxic is because of the confusion around the application of the Equality Act and its relationship with the GRA. I will do.
Can I just disagree with him on there being no impact on the single-sex provisions in the Equality Act? There is a respectable body of opinion that there will be an impact on the single-sex provisions in the Equality Act. And of course, we're waiting for guidance to come out from the EHRC. Does he agree with me that that guidance is much needed and will bring some clarity to the debate?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I do actually agree on the point of guidance, and I come on to this point next, in that it is the failure of subsequent governments since 2004 and 2010 to produce any guidance about the relationship between the GRA and the Equality Act and the exemptions that are provided for within it that have led to a very disjointed application of those exemptions in much of public life. You have those that use it to exclude absolutely everyone, you have those that use it to exclude absolutely no one, and a large majority in the middle that simply do not know what to do because there is no guidance available from the centre as to what best practice looks like. So I would urge the government to look again at the Committee for Women and Equality Select Committee recommendation in order to produce that guidance and indeed convene an advisory panel of those on both sides of the debate as to what that guidance could look like and bring it before the House so that we can debate it and discuss it. But I want to go back to focusing specifically on the application process for a gender recognition certificate as catered for within this petition. In the Select Committee inquiry, we received evidence from those who were in favour of further reform and those who were against it. But what really struck me was how much agreement there was between the two sides on the actual application process itself. Indeed, the three big asks of reform of the GRC application process were more or less welcomed universally. So I would strongly hope that the government can have a chance to look at these in a bit more detail. I will happily give way.
I thank him for giving way, and I absolutely agree. We need to have a civilised discussion about this. But given the difficulties and given that it is clear that the Act as it currently stands provides huge problems for people, for transgender people, does he agree that we actually need a reform of the Act?
Absolutely. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that intervention. And I think there is a case, there is a strong case made simply because if you look at the statistics around GRCs in particular to show that the process obviously doesn't really work. The fact that only 1 to 3% of trans people actually go through the process of obtaining a GRC, I think demonstrates to me that the process is indeed too bureaucratic, it's too expensive for many, and it simply isn't fit for purpose. So I will give way on that point.
Also the case that we ought to consider whether GRCs actually fulfil any useful purpose, because the GRA was introduced in 2004 at a time when we didn't have same-sex marriage. We now do. So what is the point of a GRC?
I think the point of a gender recognition certificate is the difficulty that trans people have in getting their legal gender recognised by very many bodies. I think that is why reform of the GRA to allow for an easier process to attain a GRC is needed. We may need to come on to a discussion later about whether or not GRCs are actually fit for purpose in their entirety, and I would absolutely welcome that discussion. But I think what we've been left with at the moment with these two bits of legislation, I think the first step would be a reform of the GRA to get us to this point, and then we can look forward to the future. Now, the changes that were recommended in the government's consultation in 2018 and in the two Women and Equality Select Committee inquiries focus around three particular asks. The first of which is the removal of the requirement to obtain a diagnosis of gender dysphoria before applying for a gender recognition certificate, as well as removing the need to provide medical reports detailing all treatment that people have undertaken, which again was something that both sides of the debate throughout the Select Committee inquiry agreed with. The 2018 government consultation showed that 64% of people agreed with removing the need for a diagnosis, and 80% supported the need to remove detailed medical reporting. The second requirement, the second ask is the removal of the spousal veto, which requires that a married trans person must obtain consent from their spouse before getting their legal gender recognised. And again, there was agreement on both sides of this in the Select Committee inquiry, and 85% of consultation respondents agreed that it should be scrapped. And finally, there was the call to remove the need for trans people to provide evidence that they have lived in their so-called acquired gender for 2 years prior to obtaining a GRC. Now, this was condemned very strongly by both sides because it was felt that this reinforces gender stereotypes, and there was no agreement on how to define or how to prove that you have lived as a man or a woman for 2 years before obtaining legal recognition of your gender. And again, nearly 80% of people that took part in the government's consultation agreed that that should be removed. So instead of having to collate all this information and submit it to the Gender Recognition Panel, which I'll just note anecdotally from the evidence that we received was very, very confusing because there doesn't seem to be any accountability as to who sits on that panel or how it operates. The call is instead for a form of Registrar General to be introduced in England and Wales, before whom trans people would have to make a legal declaration to an official in order to obtain a gender recognition certificate and legal recognition of their gender. And that would, of course, come with consequences in law for any false declarations being made. This would therefore not allow people to self-identify without an application to an official. And I think the phrase self-identify has been one that has been very confused and potentially is very unhelpful because it does conjure up images, I admit, to those from the outside who would think that, does that mean that you can just wake up one day and decide that you're going to change your gender? Well, that isn't what the petition is calling for. And of course, I don't think anyone here would really recommend that either. This model that I have outlined has been one that has already been introduced in a number of countries: Argentina, Brazil, Ireland, Denmark, Norway, France, Portugal, Greece, Iceland, Luxembourg and Malta, 4 provinces of Canada, 10 states in the United States, and is being introduced in New Zealand and Germany. I think Ireland is probably the closest example we have, and the Irish model is reported to have worked particularly well, and is probably closest to what some campaigners have been asking for. So there is a lot of agreement, Sir George, about reform of the application process to obtain a GRC. So I do hope that the government can take this away to look again, and that colleagues here and those who haven't taken part in this debate but I know would have liked to come back together and realise that politics is a battle for hearts and minds, but we don't need to be at each other's throats to talk about it. There are, of course, strongly held views and indeed a temptation to steer the conversation into areas that aren't necessarily directly relevant to the GRC. We have to appreciate that trans people do indeed face huge challenges in the country today, not least of which recognition of their gender, but also the violent and sexual crimes to which they are subjected to. They're twice as likely as other LGBT plus people to be subjected to conversion therapy, for example, and face discrimination in their everyday lives. But we must also understand that there is reasonable and understandable concern, particularly, for example, from women about the protection of sex-based rights, which comes very reasonably from an unacceptably high level of physical and sexual violence towards women, which of course creates concerns about erosions of those rights. And we must therefore allow the space and the time for everyone to be legitimately heard and find a way forward. Because change is a slow process. I know that's really frustrating to hear, particularly in the social media age that we live in at the moment, where we demand instant gratification and instant action. But the real world and the battle for hearts and minds I have found in my short time in this House to be infinitely more complex. And we have a duty, I think, to lead from the front in order to remove the toxicity out of the debate, because I don't believe that continuing with that will end well. It will just push people further into one of 2 directions, or leave them afraid to say anything or fear to act at all. So I do urge colleagues, if they would be willing to hear me, to join with me today to try and take the toxicity out of this debate, and let this be the moment that we come together to do more and express the real and genuine concerns held on both sides, so that we can work towards what everyone wants, which is a society where the rights of all are respected, and indeed what you get out of the country is what you're willing to put in. So let us try and be the leaders that the country needs on this issue right now, and calm this debate down, work together across the divide to find the answers and find the way forward. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 327108 relating to the reform of the gender recognition Act. Before I call the first speaker, I think in view of the number of people who are trying to get in on this debate, I'm going to have to impose a time limit from the beginning. And so the time limit, I think probably that might work. I may have to adjust it, if not, would be 7 minutes. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Sir George, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship. I will only make a brief contribution, Sir George, because I've expressed my views on this issue many times in this place. I don't think we actually have had enough debates on issues around the experiences, the real lived experiences of trans and non-binary people. I think we ought to have more debates and to conduct them in the civilised and courteous way in which the petition promoter suggested that we do so. And so I just wanted to start perhaps helpfully, just giving some context. I mean, I'm glad that our party is committed to ensure that trans and non-binary people can live their lives with equality, dignity and respect. And I'm very proud of my own government, the Welsh Government, in the unequivocal support that they have given for trans and non-binary rights and for reform of the GRA and the very matters that are under consideration in this petition today. Obviously, they don't have some of those powers. They've expressed their concerns about the failure to bring forward the reforms that were promised in the past by the government. And I do hope that we will see those reforms come to fruition, because they are what trans and non-binary people are requesting, they're what the allies are requesting, and they're what are needed, I believe, to ensure that they can live their lives with freedom and dignity and respect. Of course, they sit within a huge range of issues affecting the lives, which the honourable gentleman pointed out at the start of the debate. And I'm sorry, Sir George, that instead, in the debate over the past couple of years in particular, their actual lives and lived experiences have been used by some as a wedge issue, by some as a form of ridicule, or simply reduced to academic or philosophical debate, or worse, as the honourable gentleman pointed out, to some, couple of words on Twitter. These are real people. They're not represented in this part of the room today. Their voices aren't going to be heard. There are going to be many people here, I'm sure, who will speak up. And I wanted to start by just sharing a couple of reflections that I've had from the trans and non-binary community that I've spoken to. I think one of the concerns is that there has been this very unfortunate and a very vicious debate at times, Sir George, all the while where their actual needs in terms of physical health, mental health, access to public services, access to legal equality have not been being considered. And there are so many issues, whether it's the experience of hate crime, which has significantly increased, as indeed it has increased against all protected characteristics, and indeed, as we have seen, it has occurred against all women and young people. We've seen horrific incidents. But the crimes against trans people have increased significantly over the past 5 years. That's not just down to increased willingness to report. It is a fact. I will give way in a moment. It is a fact, and I certainly have had trans constituents come to me with the experiences they've had, which are horrific, alongside many others who are experiencing these things in their daily lives. And as I said, the actual issues, the actual challenges that people are facing in their lives are being put to one side. I held an event here, Sir George, a couple of years ago. I was very nervous, actually, to hold the event because of some of the things that happen whenever you speak out with the trans and non-binary community, but an event which I think was one of the most powerful things for me in this debate, which was with parents and young people, young trans people, young non-binary people, and their parents. And there were a number of members present at that event who are here today. And the most crucial thing we did, Sir George, was listen to their actual experiences, listen to what they'd been through, listen to the candour and the frankness that parents expressed about some of the challenges they had been through, and from the young people about some of the challenges that they had been through, and just to listen, not to judge, to hear what they actually had to say. But the overwhelming thing in that room was a sense of love, of care, and of support. And I think, Sir George, if we put those principles at the heart of this debate today, and indeed at the heart of this debate going forward, there are going to be others who are going to be much better placed to make the technical and legal arguments and distinctions than I can. But if we put those principles at the heart of this, remembering these are people's real lives, people's real existence, these are people who have suffered incredibly and suffer incredibly every day and every week, then I think we could help to make this place and indeed this country a better place for all trans and non-binary people. I will give way to the Honourable Lady who wants to come in.
way, and in many ways he's already answered my question, but nearly 100 hate crimes against transgender people occurred, even in Somerset Police, and probably the number in London is threefold, and we don't even know what the numbers are. Does he agree, once we talk about actually the enormous discrimination that transgender people face, that to make at least the recognition process easier would be a good step forward? And
well, I wholeheartedly agree, Sir George, with the Honourable Lady's point, and I'll end on this reflection, and no doubt, I'll receive criticism and abuse online as a result of making it, but I have spoken out in this place before about the conduct of a number of newspapers and a number of others in the stories and the way in which they're reported. And I had the displeasure a few years ago going to visit the Bishopsgate Institute, with an archive of LGBT plus material. It's absolutely fantastic resource. Hopefully much of that will end up in the new Queer Britain Museum. But looking back at some of those headlines and some of those stories from the past and the discrimination and hatred that was directed against other members of the LGBT plus community, and seeing those then reflected again today in similar headlines and similar myths and similar mistakes, and not having a courteous and respectful debate around some of the technical and legal issues, instead one that's driven, I think, to, as I said, either ridicule or hurt or actively undermine the position of people who exist and are living their lives and simply want to be able to get on with their lives in dignity and respect, I think is one of the biggest problems in this debate. And what I would urge all of those who have strong views on this debate is to think about that, think about the impact, because I don't want to be having, as I have had, Sir George, constituents, trans people, non-binary people ringing me up in tears about the latest headline they've seen in the newspaper, the latest abusive row going on Twitter or social media. We should just let people be who they want to be, respect that, give them the dignity, and show that love and compassion and respect that all human beings deserve, whatever their gender identity or their sexuality, whatever that might be. Thank you, Sir George.
Thank you, Sir George. The petition we're debating today seeks reform of the Gender Recognition Act to enable transgender people to self-identify into a new legal sex without the need for a medical diagnosis or proof of treatment. In other words, the petition seeks to allow those who have been born male to become legally female or vice versa, without any requirement to undergo changes to their hormones or their anatomy or under medical guidance. Now, let me be clear. No trans person should face discrimination, and I have nothing but compassion for those who continue to be harassed or abused or stigmatised. Adults should be free to dress and present as they wish without fear, and it is up to all of us to stand up for the dignity and respect of everyone, including trans people. But what is being requested by this petition is not a minor amendment to an existing law, or a demand for trans people to have equal rights, which they do have under UK law, and rights that should always be upheld by all of us. Rather, the demands of this petition seek what I do believe, and I'm afraid I do disagree with my honourable friend here, would be a fundamental change to the law. Because society, the law and science all testify that we as individuals can never fully define ourselves. Rather, our identity comes from a variety of external factors that we can't change, however much we may want to. The country of our birth, who our parents are, the colour of our skin, whether or not we have children. None of these physical realities can be altered by our internal thoughts or feelings, however strongly they're held. The reality, the truth, is that individual identities are complex and multidimensional, but they are as much a function of the things we cannot change as they are of the things we can. And of course the same goes for sex. Because let's be clear, human beings, like all other mammals, cannot change sex. At the moment of conception, when sperm cell fuses with egg cell, apart from rare abnormalities, there are two possible outcomes. I certainly will.
And I recognise the point that she's making, in that people often think that we have male and female. But the truth is that 1 to 2% of the global population is born intersex, which means they present characteristics of both sexes. But to put that in a perspective, 1 to 2% of the population are ginger. So is she telling me that she doesn't believe in ginger people?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I do understand the point that she's making, which is why I said that there are these rare abnormalities. But I think, well, I have to say that People who are intersex should absolutely be treated with compassion, with every medical treatment that they deserve from the moment of birth, but that is a different thing to saying that someone who is born male can choose to be female or vice versa, which is why I've said that that is rarely the case. Normally, the choice at conception or the determination at conception is either male or female, and that is the biological, the genetic fact. So at this moment of conception, this new cell, now I'll make some progress, the new cell, the unique human being, the zygote, is the blueprint for every single other cell in the person's body. The zygote divides, it divides again, and it divides again, until there are trillions of cells making up a complete human being. These cells have different functions, muscle cells, nerve cells, blood cells, but every single one of the 37 trillion cells in an adult human has the same genetic code, including the same sex chromosomes. I will.
Well, what about chimeras? There are people who have different sets of DNA within their genetics. I think she's simplifying the science here, and it's actually much more complicated than she wants to. And I know she's got a genetics degree, but I've got a biomedical science degree, so I hope we can do that.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. And as I said, I absolutely recognise that there are rare genetic abnormalities, and I am simplifying, and I am talking about the majority. But I do understand that this debate is actually not about people with genetic abnormalities. It's about people who are identifying as a different gender to their birth sex. They are two very different things, and I am talking about the latter. I know, I will make some progress. So every cell in the adult human body has the same genetic code. However much an individual may want to change sex by undergoing surgery, hormone treatment, or changing their lifestyle, it's just not scientifically possible to change our sex, because it is written in every single cell. Sex is immutable. And not only is it immutable, our sex also determines and influences a large part of our identity as people. Our biology, our psychology, our life choices, whether we can become a mother or a father, and also what diseases we may suffer from. These are established and proven scientific facts, not a matter of individual beliefs or feelings, however strongly they may be held, and I absolutely accept that they are held strongly. So, to allow somebody easily to change their sex in law would be to accept as a society that this material reality is not important or can easily be changed in a straightforward way. And I don't believe that that is a wise route to take, and it would have wide-ranging repercussions in other aspects of law. Yes.
For giving way, just for a point of clarity, what she seems to be suggesting in this section of her speech is that gender recognition and change shouldn't be part of our law currently. Have I misunderstood what she's saying?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I will come on to that. I believe what we currently have is a good compromise, and I'll explain why I think that. So I don't believe this is a wise route to take in the broad picture, but I also think there are some specific impacts of GRA reform that would also be significant, for example, threatening sex-based rights. There are sound reasons of privacy, safety and dignity for women's requirement for single-sex spaces and services. When using changing rooms and sleeping accommodation or in prison, women and girls have a right to expect that there are no males also using those spaces. Self-ID could threaten these sex-based rights, and I agree with the Honourable Member that we are awaiting guidance on that, and it could row back on decades of progress towards women's equality.
I'm curious to know whether the Honourable Member supports the current GRA and GRC because what she's talking about in prisons already exists. People can have a GRC, but they are not automatically put in the estate that the GRC, they're not automatically put in the estate, and I can give you numerous examples. They are put in depending on an assessment by the prison authorities. What's wrong with the current situation where the prison authorities make an assessment regardless of the GRC?
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I think there's a lot wrong with what's going on in prisons at the moment, but I do think that's beyond the scope of the debate. And as I said to the Honourable Lady, I will come on to why I think that the current law we have is a good compromise. So self-ID could threaten these sex-based rights and row back on a lot of progress in terms of women's equality. But also the effect on children would be hugely damaging. We are already seeing a situation in schools and online where vulnerable young people, often girls, often same-sex attracted, often autistic, are being told that the answer to their problems is to change sex. This is manifesting in a concerning rise in girls who are not only identifying as trans or non-binary, but are going on to make serious and permanent changes to their bodies that will result in lifelong medical, sexual and psychological problems. Yes, I will give way.
As a scientist, does the honourable member accept that hormone therapy isn't permanent? The whole point of it is to pause puberty in order to give a child space to make decisions and to explore their gender identity.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I don't accept that pausing puberty has no repercussions, but it's also the case that 98% of those who are prescribed hormone blockers or puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. That is the reality of what is happening at the moment, with a 5,000% increase in the number of girls referred to the... I certainly will.
Giving way, she'll be aware that at present Sir Hilary Cass has been tasked by the UK government with looking at the reasons why there has been such a huge increase in the number of particularly young girls seeking puberty blockers and surgical treatment. Does she agree with me that we would be wise to wait for the outcomes of that review before taking a final view on whether or not we should support self-ID?
Of course, anyone's entitled to make an intervention, and the Speaker is entitled to take them. I would just warn those who are on the list, however, that their chances of being called will be reduced by the amount of time they've spent on interventions. So I'm not trying to dissuade anyone from intervening, but I think they need to realise that it may jeopardise their own chances of making the speeches that they came prepared to do. Miriam Kate.
George, and I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, and I entirely agree. We must wait for the outcome of this very, very important review. So if we did reform the GRA in this way, it would send a signal to children that society accepts that it is true that one can change sex. And I don't think we should be misleading our children in this way. So I can't support the calls for reform of the GRA outlined in this petition. But I do want to say one final word about compassion, because I have no doubt that those who are calling for this change are doing so for reasons of compassion. Western culture has come to define compassion as giving an individual what they need in order to alleviate suffering. Now, of course, there's a strong argument for this, and we all as individuals have a responsibility to alleviate individual suffering wherever we can. But as legislators, we have to balance the best interests of society as a whole with the interests of individuals, and here there must always be compromise. The government's position on the GRA therefore represents a sensible compromise. It is possible for trans people to obtain a legal recognition through a GRC subject to appropriate medical checks and balances. This upholds the rights and dignity of trans individuals, but it also protects the social, legal and scientific understanding of sex that is vital to the functioning of human society.
Next call, Dame Angela Eagle.
Inestimable chairmanship. I'd like to speak to the actual issue that this petition is about, which is quite narrow, one I think that we ought to all, in our compassionate selves, be in favour of. This is about a very narrow issue about how one gets official recognition with the issuing of a gender recognition certificate, which enables trans people to change their birth certificate into the sex that they wish to be, that they regard themselves as, and access certain pension rights without suddenly finding, when they've lived their lives in the gender they wish but haven't got a gender certificate, that they get issues of inconsistencies between birth certificates and their own identity. This about respect and dignity for trans people's lives in a decision that they've made to switch the gender that they live in. The current system, as the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington, who made an extremely good speech moving this debate, hinted at in his contribution, is really very, very onerous. It's humiliating. It's very, very intrusive, and sometimes it's impossible for people, especially if they transitioned many years ago, actually to interact with. because they have to get 2 doctors to agree that they effectively suffer from a mental illness. They have to then demonstrate to a panel that they don't know, that there's no feedback from, that they've lived in their acquired gender for 2 years, and that requires massive collections of documentation such as bills and a whole range of issues for 2 years, and can run into thousands of pages to prove to a panel who are making judgments that they ought to be issued with this certificate. They then have to produce other legal things which all cost money in order to make a submission to this panel. I've talked to trans people who've been refused gender recognition certificates, and there is no feedback from the panel as to why. So they've got to do it 2 years after they've begun living in their, at least, in their acquired gender. They've got to collect all these things. They often have to pay doctors because you can't get access to these kinds of services on the NHS, much less can you get access to the medical services you need to have surgery or take hormone replacement therapy, often without going private. And you then don't get any feedback on why you've been refused. Now, this isn't the kind of process that any decent civilised society would put anybody through. And therefore, I think that, as the Honourable Member for Colshalton and Wallington was saying in his opening remarks, what we've got here is a very narrow issue about gender recognition certificates themselves. There is a reason why only between 1% and 5% of trans people have applied successfully for these certificates, simply because it's almost impossible for them to do so and keep their mental health stable. And yeah, I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's making an extremely powerful speech that's rooted in people's real life experiences. Does my honourable friend agree that the GRA needs to be reformed to make the process more straightforward and quicker, to remove the need for medical reports, but also to offer legal recognition for non-binary people and for those under the age of 18?
Yes, I strongly, Sir George, agree with the observations that my honourable friend has made, because the Gender Recognition Act, when it was passed in 2004, was groundbreaking, world-leading legislation. It is now very, very out of date, and it makes no mention whatsoever of non-binary people. If you want a gender recognition certificate, you have to pick a gender. But as we are increasingly coming to realise, Sir George, many people now regard themselves as non-binary and don't want to make that binary choice, but they don't regard themselves either as a man or a woman in the sense, that binary sense that we all grew up with. And we need to ensure that we can facilitate their capacity to navigate through bureaucracies and have a presence in our state and a dignity and respect in our state that accords with their feelings about themselves and their view of themselves. And that is all that we are talking about. This debate is not about any of the other issues, and I'm more than happy to debate them in terms. And if people want to compare nasty threats that they've had on social media or other places, I could do a pretty good job. And I condemn anyone that's had to put up with that rubbish. It's not a way to deal with things, and I hope that we can keep our heads and have a civilised debate here. I was extremely saddened that after 2018, when the government said that they were going to make this modest change, that we've had a hold-up for this length of time, whilst trans people have been kept on tenterhooks, whilst attacks on trans people, the othering of trans people, the tropes that now appear about what trans people are and that they're a danger, tropes that I remember being directed at LGBT people in the 1980s, that you can't trust them around children, they're weird, you can't, they're violent, they're a threat. That is all going on while the government hasn't acted. And so I am very disappointed indeed that the government, the Equalities Department, hasn't acted on this. And then when it's finally produced a response, 21 months after the original consultation, that is effectively cut the cost of having a certificate that's almost impossible to get from £140 to £5, that it's talked about digitalisation and done absolutely nothing about a process that is humiliating, intrusive, difficult to deal with, and ought to be abandoned. Now, is this a threat to others in our society? I would say no. We have seen the reform of gender recognition certificates and processes throughout the world. After being leading in the world, we are now falling very, very behind in our failure to reform this process, which is why the Scottish Government wants to reform it, which is why the Welsh Government wants to reform it, which is why we should want to reform it, just to make it easier for already vulnerable people who desperately require this kind of official form and declaration so that they can have access to pensions, for example. All we need to do is get on with this modest reform, and we need to do it now, and I hope that we will hear from the Government Minister when he responds to this debate that we're going to have a much better approach to reform of the GRA than we've had to date. Thank you.
Will Price.
Thank you, Sir George, for your chairmanship today. And it was a pleasure also to listen to the opening speech by my honourable friend, the member for Carshalls and Wallington, who I think set the tone extremely well. Because if there's one thing I think about this debate, it has become very toxic. Dare I say, it is rather too binary. There is, in effect, a clash of rights here between sex and gender, and I'm afraid we, as a political class, have failed. We have failed to show leadership in this area, and it's high time that we did, and we should not run shy of debating these issues. But I rather think that viewing this through the sentiments in the petition and through the existence of GRA, the current Gender Recognition Act, we're rather limiting ourselves as to what the remedies are to make sure that we properly empower people of all genders and however anyone wishes to live and express themselves by looking at it through an act which, as I said in my intervention to him, predates same-sex marriage. And I think we really need to have a fresh look at how we approach all issues of sex and gender in our legislation. Because the world has changed, and you know, the Honourable Lady was absolutely right. In 2004, this was groundbreaking, but now it does look very, very out of date. And I'll just make one comment about the toxicity of this debate. I think, you know, we can all condemn the abuse and vitriol that people are exposed to when they engage in this debate. But the truth of the matter is we have to recognise that the reason this happens is because for many people this is very, very personal. It's very personal for the transgender person who thinks that their existence is being erased or being said that it doesn't exist. It's equally personal for women who feel that their sex-based rights that they and their forebears have fought for generations are being erased. But you know, it should not be beyond the wit of us all as policymakers to really overcome that, because the truth is they're both right. They're both right. And we've got to get beyond that and keep up with meaningful solutions. So, as I say, I think we need a fresh look at the whole issue of how we tackle sex and gender in our legislation. And, you know, I just come to the points mentioned by the Honourable Lady and my honourable friend in his opening statement about the fact that so few trans people actually apply for a GRC. And I would say that perhaps begs the question, do we need a GRC? Do we need a GRA that enables people to have a certificate that confirms their gender? Because in this country, we don't need papers to tell us who we are and how we live. And that's really the point. What useful purpose does a GRC serve? And I look forward to hearing the Minister's views on that, because that's the truth is, we should go, I know we're looking at it from what's been described as a minor reform, but let's just challenge the purpose of what this documentation is designed to deliver. Because does it really deliver any enhanced rights over and above what anyone has in the law as it is? In fact, for a lot of people, by moving towards self-ID, it puts trans people into a collision course with women's rights. And I don't think it's a collision course that anyone really wants to see. So I'd like to see a much more challenging way of doing that. And for me, I think the way forward isn't about establishing, gender recognition certificates. It's about really going into our laws and determining where sex matters and where gender presentation, gender identity can prevail. And really, there are just a number of areas where sex really needs to trump gender. One of them is health. It's actually fundamental and helpful for people's declared gender to trump their sex on their medical records. And we're seeing people not being called for routine screenings based on sex, for example. In the criminal justice system, the Honourable Gentleman said that transgender prisoners are risk assessed. Well, they are if they haven't got a GRC. But if a trans woman with a GRC is automatically put in the women's estate, it's a transgender who self-declares who is risk assessed. So we have transgender prisoners with and without a GRC in the women's estate. But the truth of the matter is, it should be for service providers to risk assess their premises. That would be a safer situation all around. And again, if we're relying on a piece of paper that actually is no longer necessary, because again, I come back to the fact that Act was passed to enable same-sex marriages, which are now uniformly enabled in law. So again, I say, do we need a GRC? I think the other area where sex really matters is sports, and it appalls me, and I'm sure it appalls most people, that sports governing bodies are turning a blind eye to women's sport being destroyed by transgender athletes, where there's an innate physiological advantage. This is all practical common sense, and I think because we, as a political class, have neglected gripping with these issues for so long, we have allowed this toxic debate to happen. We've allowed the extremes to happen, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to, as my honourable friend said in his opening remarks, to actually bring back some common sense. We, as legislators, need to show cool heads and actually come to a law which suits everyone, which empowers transgender people to be who they want to be and to live their lives free of prejudice and discrimination, but which also enables everyone to be comfortable with that and enables the protection of women's spaces. Thank you, Mr. George.
Chairman, look, I think we've got to start with this debate, and actually I agree with some of the things that my honourable friend opposite, we sit on the same committee of constitutional affairs together, we work positively together. I agree that the debate has become toxic, and I agree that actually we need to find a way forward, and we need to show leadership. But I think we need to also step back and work out why there was a call initially, now over 4 years ago, for there to be changes. And that call was because the current Gender Recognition Act and Gender Recognition Certificates were not working. They were not working because at the time the WHO, this is one of the reasons, was going through a process of removing gender dysphoria as a registered diagnosis. As this year, the World Health Organization no longer recognises gender dysphoria as a legitimate diagnosis that any doctor in the world should be giving. We now require our doctors to break WHO guidelines to continue to abide with the Gender Recognition Act. That alone, not talking even about the barriers to getting a Gender Recognition Act, the social problems, the issues and the trauma that it causes for people, the fact that it maybe doesn't actually properly reflect kind of the lived lives and the biology, because it only reflects actually the mental health diagnosis. Putting all of that aside, the very fact that we in this country are now requiring our doctors to give a diagnosis that is no longer internationally recognised should mean that we change the Act, even if it's changing the diagnosis and what a doctor or what a medical professional is looking at. If you're going to then change the Act, it is then incumbent on us to say, well, first of all, what would a doctor diagnose? Is it acceptable for it to be a mental health diagnosis anymore? Or actually, are there other indicators that are more important? Someone's self-declaration, someone's evidence that they might provide in that sense, someone's commitment to live in a particular way going forward. Maybe those are better indicators for how someone is living. Now, I'm happy to actually have a debate where some people might say, it might not be my position, but some people might say, well, we need to put some other indicators in there that are about how your neighbours or friends might have seen you, like you do with a passport photo when you get that signed off and it says it's a true likeness. I can understand why people might say, well, we want to make sure that there's other documentation. But clearly, the documentation that is provided at the moment is insufficient and doesn't work. I heard the other day, for example, one person that provided 2 years' worth of statements. In 6 months, it took to hear the case. The panel then rejected because they said the 2 years was 6 months out of date. It is a Kafkaesque kind of situation. You submit the documentation, the delay happens, so then they reject it, and so no wonder so few people then feel that they are enabled to submit. And in the end, they had to resubmit, providing evidence effectively in the future, as it were, to be able to submit it and to be able to get them. So there is a problem with the system, and I think that is the starting point we have to come from. And that is the starting point the government had. But unfortunately, they opened up a Pandora's box 4 years ago, where everyone's worst fears and nightmares could be ploughed in, on all sides of the debate and argument. And rather than showing leadership, they allowed it to fester. And now what's happened is a process of suggesting that they'll remove the fees, ignoring, of course, that you have to pay often for diagnosis, you have to pay for doctor's letters. It still costs hundreds of pounds, and the barriers are rather high. And then talk about going online might make it actually harder, not easier, for some groups of people. So actually we do need to step back and look at that process. Because I hope that we all agree, whilst we might have different philosophical views on some of the other wider issues, that people should be able to, a minority of people, of course a small minority of people, should be able to change their gender from the gender that was assigned at birth, and that gender will have been assigned at birth usually because of a physical because of a visual check of that individual. No further requirements of what goes on that birth certificate. And so means that many people will grow up feeling very different. But I also think we should recognise that self-ID is a particularly difficult term. It's not particularly a useful term. Most of our gendered spaces are already self-ID. There is no law in this country on who uses the toilet. Quite right, because actually where they've been introduced in other parts of the world, they're a nightmare. And if there were, it would probably be, I would use the term cisgendered women, but other people could use other terms that they prefer. I'm happy to have that discussion. But it would be women who tend to use the toilets in public events and go into the men's toilet when there's a huge queue in the women's, that would end up getting criminalised if we did have laws that say it was a criminal act to go into the wrong gendered toilet. So clearly it would be bonkers to do, it would be stupid to do something like that. So most of those spaces are already self-ID. So we're only talking about a very small number of spaces that might need protections, and they are already in the current protections. Now it's quite right, we need proper and better guidelines of how they should be interpreted. But those guidelines need to be written with the trust of all in the community. They need not to be seen as some political backlash one way or another, but they need to bring everyone on board. And that also means not trying to rewrite or undermine the progress that many people feel that they have already achieved. You can't suddenly take away people's lived lives and their rights away from them. And for many trans people, that's what they feel that the debate is happening to them. They feel that there has been some progress, and now people are trying to shove them in the box. I'm not saying that that's the intention of anyone. I'm saying that's how they feel, and we need to address that and move forward with them. I would use the word positive declaration identification. Maybe that's too wordy, but finding a new word beyond self-ID is probably useful in this debate, because what we're talking about is a legal process. And then finally, I want to say, in the last 10 seconds, what is important is that we ensure that we have fairness in this country and we don't pit different groups together. This is not an argument about one or the other.
Richardson.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship in this important debate today. And my thanks to my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for his powerful opening statement on behalf of the Petitions Committee and the petitioners. The debate has become toxic on social media, and quite often when we talk about taking the toxicity out of the debate, we often mean the other side to us. But I congratulate my honourable friend for his clear balance in his opening remarks, recognising both sides of the debate. We live in a liberal democracy where everyone is free to live their lives to their potential, making choices that allow them to live in alignment with their values and true selves. And I support those adults who wish to undertake gender transition and apply for a gender recognition certificate. One of the things that I enjoy most about being an MP is the privilege of knocking the doors of my constituents. And earlier this year, at the beginning of the year, I met a transgender constituent, and we had a long conversation on the doorstep about the challenges they were facing in gaining a gender recognition certificate. We continue to be in regular correspondence, and I'm more than happy to help where I can on these issues for any constituents who need my support. I understand the petitioners' concerns about the process of gaining legal recognition for those wishing to change gender, especially the time taken to live in their chosen gender and a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Analysis of the current process showed that in 75% of cases, a decision is made within 20 weeks of application for a GRC, and that over 90% of applications are successful. Where applicants don't provide enough information, the panel gives an opportunity and support for additional documents to complete the application and give it a further chance to succeed. This petition closed 13 months ago, and in that time, the debate on self-ID has drawn in the voices of those who feel they may be impacted by the ability for anyone to self-ID at any point without the appropriate checks and balances. Women in particular have raised concerns about protecting their ability to access single-sex spaces and services where they are at their most vulnerable. As honourable friends have mentioned already, these include refuges and hospital wards, and there are also concerns from female prisoners who have no choice but to live in close confines with a male-bodied prisoner, potentially not taking hormone therapy, and who may choose to self-ID as a woman but has not gone down the legal route to show their intention to live as a different gender. It is, of course, difficult to measure an individual's intention. However, the current legal framework provides a compassionate yet balanced approach through ensuring that those who want to transition have lived under their new identity. Importantly, it provides time for reflection and assessment for those who want to transition, and I believe that the best decisions are ones that are based on good reflection. This point pertains to us in this place and the decisions that we take as lawmakers. There needs to be sufficient time for all of us to understand both sides of an argument and hear all voices, not just the lobby group that is the best funded and has the loudest voice. The debate on reforming the Gender Recognition Act and provision of gender recognition certificates is by no means over, and the government response has been to acknowledge that the process for applying for a GRC needs to be kinder and more straightforward. I believe the government has got the balance right by decreasing the cost of a GRC from £140 to £5, and with the intention to move the application process fully online. However, as long as this debate continues, I will be speaking up for women and girls in particular who need to have a voice representing them in this debate and whose rights to access single-sex spaces needs to be protected. We all deserve to have our human rights acknowledged, respected and recognised in law. Sometimes these rights come into conflict, and it shouldn't be in the too hard basket to find a common sense solution, even if that requires additional funding, so that we can protect and support everyone.
Thank you. Mary Foy.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. When I've approached this issue previously, I've preferred to listen rather than to speak. And to learn rather than to lecture. And I want my action to be founded in evidence and driven by compassion, whilst underwritten by an unshakable belief that trans rights are human rights. And as a socialist, it's always been my goal to represent the underrepresented and to strengthen the rights of minorities and to make our country as easy to live in for the vulnerable as it is for the privileged. Sadly, it's a fact, not an opinion, that our country isn't currently a welcoming place for trans and non-binary people. Yes, it's better than some places, but better isn't enough. And it's little consolation to those affected, especially when the level of LGBTQ plus crime has doubled in the last 5 years. And as MPs, we have a responsibility to drive positive change that materially improves the lives of trans and non-binary people. And it's obvious that the Gender Recognition Act is in urgent need of reform. The process for changing gender is too complex, too bureaucratic and too mentally damaging to those who must endure it. Many people wait for over 5 years for initial appointment at a gender identity service, while also attempting to navigate the many hurdles in the way of legal recognition of their gender. The existing system simply isn't fit for purpose, and the need for overarching reform is clear. This reform must begin with the introduction of self-identification, and it's a damning indictment that this government's record on trans rights is that they've refused to deliver on some of their promises. And there is very strong support for the introduction of self-ID and progressive reform to the Gender Recognition Act, with 137,000 people signing today's petition. The response to the government's own consultation on this issue showed overwhelming support for removing the need for the distressing and often humiliating bureaucratic hurdles that prevent people from achieving legal gender recognition, including scrapping the need for a gender dysphoria diagnosis, a medical report, and the evidence that an individual had been living their preferred gender for at least 2 years. And whilst this debate is often portrayed as a clash of rights between the hard-won rights of women and the advancement of trans rights, the reality of the situation simply doesn't support this argument. In 2020, polling by YouGov found that 57% of women supported trans people being able to self-ID, with just 21% opposed. There's simply no contradiction between a feminist being a feminist and a trans ally. And I'm therefore keen to reject the culture war that some are all too happy to stir up, because to engage with it ignores the very real human element of the issue. Trans people are not a political football. They do not want to be the defining cultural issue of our times, and they're tired of their very right to exist being debated. They simply want to live their lives without barriers, discrimination or abuse. Is that really too much to ask?
Honourable Lady for the City of Durham, the city of my alma mater, and enjoyed her contribution about listening before taking part in these difficult debates. And that's why I really want to pay huge tribute to my honourable friend for Carshalton of Wallington for the tone he took in opening this debate. A really, really important lesson in how to conduct these very difficult conversations. And here I also want to thank my honourable friend for Thurrock. Over the last 2 years, we have spent many hours discussing these issues, not least as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Global LGBT Rights, trying to put together a common position that could be agreed by all the LGBT groups of all the major political parties of the group itself, and then that would be understood all the reasonable concerns coming from people who are described as gender critical, and to meet those anxieties with all the reasonable reassurances that people ought to be able to expect. Now, it is to my great shame and pity that we didn't manage to convince the government to adopt that position within a wider statement of reform about the Gender Recognition Act. I urge my honourable friend the Minister to revisit that statement. It's still, I think, absolutely valid. It's sitting there on the website of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and I urge him to look at it as a basis for how to move forward here, how to find the reassurance around the side issues around the Gender Recognition Act itself. What we actually need is for the heat to be taken out of this debate and let the light in. And as many people have pointed out, what a gender recognition certificate does is very limited. They simply allow a trans person to record their gender accurately on their birth certificate and to be fitted into the appropriate actuarial models for pension provision and apply for a job or a university degree without fear of being outed as by default. They don't have any legal bearing on provisions around single-sex spaces, which are governed by the provisions of the Equality Act, and they are in large part technical problems. But they do have an outsized impact on individual trans persons' rights to privacy and dignity. And as a Conservative committed to protecting the rights and freedoms of the individual, I would like to see this process improved so it can best serve the people it's meant to protect. The current system is Byzantine and bureaucratic and contains provisions which, as others have said, after 26 years, seem to border, frankly, on the cruel. I would highlight in particular a requirement to live in one's new gender for 2 years and the spousal veto. I'm not sure that I can imagine a universally satisfactory benchmark of masculinity or femininity. Without any agreed definition, how can it be reasonable or fair to expect any person to live within such poorly circumscribed limits? I don't envy the members of the Gender Recognition Panel who have to hack their way through this Gordian knot of legal ambiguity and cultural stereotype to implement their decisions. And as a gay man who was married, is now separated from a woman with whom I have 2 children, I'm still friends, I know all too well that coming out as an LGBT plus person can have significant effects on a marriage. It's also clear that the current system serves only to make very personal decisions even more difficult. And giving one partner extraordinary control over another's autonomy doesn't seem right today. I recognise that in certain circumstances, one partner's transition may affect the integrity of a marriage and agree with the Women and Equalities Select Committee report that it would be sensible to offer more streamlined routes to annulment in this instance. Ultimately, the failures of the system as it currently stands are evidenced by the minuscule take-up of the gender recognition certificate. Only 4,910 certificates have ever been issued at the time of the 2018 consultation, as little as 1 to 3% of the UK trans population. This is despite the fact that when surveyed, the vast majority of trans people declare an interest in obtaining a gender recognition certificate. It's patent that the process is not fit for purpose and does not adequately serve the population it is meant to protect. And none of the changes introduced in 2020 have changed that at all. The recent appointments of my noble friend Lord Herbert as the government's special envoy on LGBT rights and my honourable friend joining the Equalities team and responding to this debate are a happy harbinger of this government's renewed commitment to the dignity and rights of trans people. Reform of the GRA would not only bring the UK into line with other Western countries, such as Ireland, Denmark, France and Greece, it would bring the technical aspects of the law governed by the GRA into line with other aspects of UK law today. Changing the gender...
giving way, would he agree with me that one of the most egregious parts of the current process is that there is no right to appeal, which completely goes against the principles of natural justice in almost every other part of our statute book, and that is one part that is not planning to be changed.
The Honourable Lady made the point extremely well and succinctly. So, changing the gender recorded on your passport or driving licence doesn't require a gender recognition certificate. Changing the gender on your bank account, medical and employment records, doesn't require a gender recognition certificate, and changing one's name doesn't require a gender recognition certificate. I can see no logical reason as to why the gender marker on the fundamental document that does give one's entitled to one's nationality, from which every other piece of one's identity then flows, why the gender marker on that certificate should be subject to more prohibitive regulation than any of these other documents and processes. But it's the fundamental importance of the birth certificate that does mean there needs to be a gender recognition certificate process. And to continue to enshrine this inconsistency within British equality law only exposes trans people to the threat of discrimination. Reform of the GRA would form a simple, natural component of the government's agenda to harmonise equality law and to implement practical and purposeful policy to make a tangible change to the lives of trans people. And 137,000 people putting their name to this petition that we're debating today ought to give the government pause for thought. It's as many as took part in a massive consultation on the GRA in the first place. This issue does matter. It's not an enormous change, and I think we should make it.
Very black.
Thank you, Chair. Under your chairmanship. Now, as has been covered very eloquently by previous speakers, having a GRC actually helps in only a handful of legal situations, such as marriage, taxes and death. That's it. Nothing to do with prisons. A GRC is not required to update the sex on your passport or your driver's licence. A GRC is not required to use single-sex spaces, such as toilets or changing rooms. And what we do know is that the current process is deeply invasive, traumatising, unnecessary and dehumanising. There are 17 countries in the last decade that have passed reform of some kind in GRA, and there's been no complaints. There is no sound argument for this legislation to be delayed anymore. And yet, if you watch the media, we are constantly bombarded with this idea that there are legitimate concerns. And that's fair. I don't doubt there are legitimate concerns out there. But the answers are also out there. So whenever I've actually tried to pin down someone as to what is the legitimate concern, it always seems to relate back to this concept of self-ID. So firstly, let me say this. Self-ID is not a new concept. It's the right all of us have to identify who we are. Every time you fill in a form, you are self-identifying your nationality, your sexual orientation, your religion. Every time you go to pee, you are self-identifying which facility best suits your needs. Do I need baby facilities? Do I need a disabled toilet, male or female? Is there a unisex toilet? The Equality Act in 2010 made explicit that trans people also have the right to self-ID. And it laid out exemptions for single-sex providers if any issues were ever to arise. Now, reforms to the Gender Recognition Act do not affect the Equality Act or the exemptions within it. It is not a reason to delay reform. Now, we hear claims that women's rights are being threatened. We've heard that today. Well, I'm a woman. I don't feel threatened. If anything, the thing that makes me feel most threatened is quite often the very aggressive and often male anonymous accounts who proclaim to be defending me from something. Because if we look at what most experienced women's organisations and female service providers, what do they say about GRA reform? Well, we see overwhelming support. We see acceptance. We see active campaigning, not just for GRA reform, but for the trans community more broadly, because they have been dealing with these issues long before the Equality Act was even written. We've had 3 public consultations showing overwhelming support for reform, particularly amongst women, consistently amongst women. Women's rights are unaffected by GRA reform, and the majority of women know it. But the truth is that the GRA reform has actually only been delayed because it has become a battleground for a proxy war, for a culture war. It's become a breeding ground of disinformation, radicalisation, and the rollback of already established LGBT+ rights. The rest of the world is watching right now as Britain is in the full grasp of a moral panic. The fact that Britain has been internationally identified as having a problem with transphobia hasn't come out of thin air. Despite expert opinion, despite mountains of evidence, despite knowing the lived experiences of trans and non-binary people, despite numerous consultations and debates, 5 years on, we're still dragging our heels. And as legislators, as I said at the start, we have a responsibility to educate ourselves about this stuff. I think 5 years is more than long enough. As legislators, we have allowed disinformation and confusion to run rife. We've created an environment that allows transphobia and ignorance to thrive. So when we see that hate crimes against LGBT+ people or self-harm has risen in the trans community, can we really go home and say that we are completely blameless? So let me make it as clear as I can. If someone doesn't support self-ID, then their issue is not with the Gender Recognition Act, it's with the Equality Act. And if someone wants to start removing established rights from over a decade ago in the Equality Act, then at least be honest about that. Tell people that that's what you're campaigning for. Say it with your chest, but do not dare say that you are doing it in the name of defending women, because it just doesn't stick. Now, if not, if we don't pursue these reforms, all I can say, Chair, is I hope history judges us as harshly as we deserve.
Pollard.
Thank you very much, Sir George. It's good to see you in the chair. And I'd like to thank the member for Carshalton and Wallington for introducing this debate so clearly. I'm a trans ally. I believe strongly that trans men, trans women are women, and being non-binary is valid. I'm proud to be Plymouth's first out Member of Parliament. I think it gives me not just a platform, but it gives me a responsibility to talk about LGBT rights. And I'm proud to be the first person to get massive gay in Hansard when I was speaking into a debate with this before. because for me, it makes it authentically Luke. It makes it something that I can look at and go, well, that is me. And actually, this debate actually needs a lot more authenticity in it. It needs a lot more lived experiences. It needs a lot more actual reality for trans and non-binary people to be present in it. Because if we had that, yes, we would have more discussion about hate crimes and more discussion about fear. But you know what we'd also have? We'd have more laughter. We'd have more honesty. We'd have more love and compassion. We'd have more authenticity of people able to be themselves, and we could revel and celebrate in people able to be themselves, free from a fear about not being who they are, and a pain that prevents them from being who they genuinely are. Yeah, briefly.
Very quickly, I agree with everything that he says, but is it also not important that we listen to the fear of women? And I'm not the one who will stoke the fear of women, but is it not important that we give that space to women to at least express what they fear?
Well, I thank the honourable member for agreeing that I'm a massive gay, and I appreciate that in her speech in there. I think there is a place that we need to listen to groups that feel like they're not being heard in this debate, and I'll come to that in just one moment. I think we need to look at the specifics of what we are debating here today, because my speech could talk about trans rights in the widest sense. I could talk about hate crime, I could talk about a whole range of things, but the petition doesn't talk about those things. The petition that we are here to debate is actually very specific. It talks about updating a broken and bureaucratic system. It talks about something that's not working. It talks about something that's costly. Costly to the taxpayer and costly to the person going through the system. And in that space, we should all agree that it is broken, and we should all agree that it should be fixed. I think the agreement that we are so painfully trying to avoid finding with each other is the one that we should pull out of this debate and say, actually, the GRA should be reformed. It is a broken system. It doesn't deliver what we need. It incurs massive cost, not just in terms of pounds, shillings and pence of people applying to go through it and massing the documents, but in the cost of the mental health crises that frequently follows the experience of going through the GRA process, in terms of the lost opportunities, in terms of the jobs not taken, in terms of the taxes not spent, not accrued. We need to look at the lost opportunities, and that's why it's so important that we look at this. I agree with my honourable friend from Brighton that self-ID is a problematic term. It is. It is difficult, because it has opened up the ability for people to attach things to this debate that are not in it currently. And if it is to be a debate where we can attach more and more things to it, we lose sight of the bit where we all agree. Because in this space, there is lots that we do agree on. And there's actually less that we disagree on. But if we put the focus on where we disagree rather than where we do agree, then we can find ways of throwing stones at each other, which I don't believe is right. We can find ways of using language which is unhelpful. I am not abnormal because I have a boyfriend. My trans friends are not abnormal because they are trans. And I think we should be clear about this. And it's not suitable to have the word but at the end of it when we say something. We need to recognise the innate human value in each of us along the way. I do want us to look in particular at the process that the GRA is causing difficulty on. And I share the concerns that have been raised more eloquently than I can about the difficulties in amassing the documents, the delay, the lack of a right of appeal, the confusion around it, the fear for many trans people of having a panel of people they do not know deciding over their lives. That is something that is humiliating and dehumanising for lots of people. And if we had this in any other walk of life, to access any other public service, we would all, regardless of our party, be saying that this is an inefficient and uncaring process, and we'd be calling for its reform. Yeah. So let's focus on that part to make sure it can be there. Because when I was asking my trans friends in Plymouth about what they wanted to see as part of this, yes, they agreed that the GRA process isn't working. They're very clear on that. Those that have tried to participate in it are very clear. But what they'd like us to focus on more is actually to get through this debate and then to talk about healthcare, to talk about the difficulties that they can in accessing healthcare. Because just as justice delayed is justice denied, we need to be clear that healthcare delayed is healthcare denied as well. And there's one part of the debate which hasn't been mentioned so far, and that is about a regional inequality that sometimes comes with this. Much of the debate around trans healthcare actually has a metropolitan flavour to it. Tends to talk about London or Manchester or even Brighton. It doesn't talk about Plymouth. It doesn't talk about the experience in the southwest. It doesn't always talk about the incredibly long waiting lists. The waiting list at the West of England Gender Identity Clinic stands at 5 years, 7 months. That's not a waiting list to be proud of. That's a waiting list to shame us. And that's why we need to look at what is possible that we can ensure changes here. And I think then we also need to look at why the delay. And this is why I turn to the Minister, because I hope the Minister will be able to speed this through the government processes. But there's 3 questions I think that are worth looking at the delay. Why is there a delay in the first place? Why has it taken the machinery of government so long to come through? It's because the delay is deliberate. It's not accidental. It is a deliberate space that has been created to weaponise a debate, to cause division, where the consequences of that space do not bother the people that have caused it. Increase in hate crime, increase in abuse, increase in assaults, increase in hate online, in person. That is a consequence of where we are in this. What is the cost of the delay? The cost of the delay is people's lives, are people's experiences and people's interaction. Because allowing someone to change their birth certificate does not deal with going to a toilet, choosing which toilet you go to. Everyone pees. We need to get over this. Everyone pees. And everyone should have the right to pee along the way. But who benefits from this delay as well? If we look at the cost of it, what's the benefit of it? There is no benefit to this, unless your objective is to create a culture war. Because in the narrow debate that we are looking at on the petition, in the narrow changes on the birth certificate to afford pension rights, there is no benefit to the taxpayer, there is no benefit to the government, not on a logistical administrative sense. And we must ensure that there is no benefit politically for anyone in my party or anyone else's that choose to benefit from the increased hate and assaults and abuse on a marginalised group. My final point, Sir George, is this one. Is the struggle for equality is a long and difficult one. We all have to keep fighting for equality along the way. Some of us will use decent arguments, some of us use lived experience, some of us will attempt at humour to do so, but we must keep it up. But we know from the experience of the equality movements to date that we don't win by bashing one protected group with the rights of another protected group. That is not how we create equality, that's how we create the opposite of it. And I hope the Minister will speed up the process, reform the GRA so we can get to other issues that matter to the trans community. Thank you.
Joanna Cherry.
I make reference to my entry in the Register of Interests where I'm listed as a member of the advisory group of the not-for-profit organisation Sex Matters, and I'm also a supporter of the Lesbian, Gay and Bisexual Alliance, and proud to be so. The Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport says that he's a massive gay. Well, I'm a massive lesbian. Rather more massive than I was in my younger years. But anyway, I want to challenge everyone who said in this debate this afternoon that they want a respectful debate on reform of the GRA. And I want to challenge them to live up to their words and listen to the concerns that are held by many women and same-sex attracted people about the dangers of conflating sex with gender. Like them, I share the view that the introduction of self-identification of sex would negatively impact on existing provisions under the Equalities Act, and that this view is valid and well-founded, has been supported by the recent intervention of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Their concerns centre on the potential consequences for individuals and society of extending the ability to change legal sex from a small defined group who've demonstrated their commitment and ability to live in their acquired gender to a much wider group who identify as the opposite gender at a given point. So it is not a modest reform. It's a reform with potential consequences, including those relating to the collection and use of data, the participation and drug testing in competitive sport, measures to address discrimination barriers facing women, and practices within the criminal justice system. Now, reform of the Gender Recognition Act is proposed in Scotland and supported by my party. And last year, our manifesto for the Scottish election said that we would work with trans people, women, equality groups, legal and human rights experts to identify the best and most effective way to improve and simplify the process by which a trans person can obtain legal recognition so that the trauma with that process is reduced. And our manifesto also said that we will ensure that these changes do not affect the rights or protections that women currently have under the Equality Act. And I was content to support that policy, which did not commit the SNP to a policy of self-ID. And what I have to say today is in line with my party's promise to work with women, equality groups, legal and human rights experts, and to ensure that reforms to the GRA don't affect the rights or protections that women currently have under the Equality Act. Now, under the Equality Act, there are a number of protected characteristics, and they include sex, sexual orientation, belief, which we now know, thanks to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, includes gender-critical beliefs, such as I hold. And the Equality Act also protects people who are at any stage of a personal journey of transition, or indeed detransition. And so widely accepted are those protected characteristics that when my party were trying to win the independence referendum in Scotland in 2014, our current First Minister and then Deputy First Minister produced a draft constitution for an independent Scotland which would have enshrined those personal characteristics in the fundamental law of an independent Scotland alongside the human rights protected by the ECHR. Now, I just want to correct something that the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemptown said. There are laws about who can use which toilet. Under the and women shouldn't be expected to share their intimate spaces with men. Under the Equality Act, security staff and school supervisors, etc., are allowed to set and enforce single-sex rules. The Equality Act exceptions allow that. It's not a matter of criminal law, it's a matter of the civil law. So it's important to be clear about these things. Because if we lose clarity over what the words male and female mean, it will make it more difficult to set and enforce clear and simple rules for female-only services and women's sports. Now, some people have been very critical of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission for seeming to have modified their position on self-identification for trans people and reform of the Gender Recognition Act. But Baroness Falkner has been very clear that they have done so because new evidence about the tension between trans and women's rights has emerged. And I would remind those who've sought to impugn the Equality and Human Rights Commission and Baroness Falkner that her appointment was unanimously approved by the Women and Equalities Committee and the Joint Committee of Human Rights after an evidential hearing in this Parliament. So there is ample evidence that the concerns of the Equality and Human Rights Commission are well-founded. And in fact, only last week in Scotland, we had two major legal decisions seemingly in conflict about the meaning of sex in law. Fortunately, because of the appellate system, we know that the appellate court's decision will take precedence. And the appellate court in Scotland was very clear that as our current law stands under the Equality Act, sex is not interchangeable with gender. There's a protected characteristic of sex, but there's not one of gender. There is a protected characteristic of gender reassignment. But the appeal court in Scotland was very clear that sex means male or female in law based on biological sex. That's the highest interpretation we have of the Equality Act in our law at present. So the word women in the Equality Act doesn't include males who self-identify as women. Now, to find out what the general populace think about self-ID, we can look at some recent polling. And we've had 2 big opinion polls in Scotland in the last month and also a BBC survey, which have shown that while the majority of Scots support equal rights for trans people, as for the avoidance of doubt, do I, they are unhappy about the implications of a system of self-ID of sex without a gatekeeper. Not because it will discriminate against trans people, but because it opens up self-identification of sex to anyone, to a much wider group than trans people. Now, many of the groups, like LGB Alliance, who've tried to promote a respectful dialogue in relation to these matters, have not had the sort of reception that the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington has suggested they shouldn't, and they've been vilified, sometimes by members of this House, and that's not right. Hear, hear. We need to have a respectful debate. By all means, let's reform the 2004 Act, but let's do it in a way that respects the protected characteristics that are enshrined in our Equality Act and takes into account the legitimate concerns of many women and same-sex attracted people. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Andy?
Thank you, Mr Chairman. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I want to begin by paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for his excellent opening remarks and his tightrope walk through what is an incredibly difficult issue. I think he did an absolutely outstanding job. It was a wet and windy winter evening. Around about 2013, I made my way across to Edinburgh for a consultation that was being run by the Equalities Network in Scotland. And it was on the choice of campaign activity following the successful equal marriage campaign. I was the only politician that turned up. It was myself and a room full of trans men and women, and we had a really fantastic discussion and debate about how important it was to improve visibility and acceptance and inclusion, and I gave that process my full support on that evening. Indeed, I've been campaigning for LGBT rights all my adult life. I have lived my life professionally, but in the open. I was out at work before it was trendy, and I have faced down prejudice in the workplace with the usual tropes of, I remember one particularly challenging story where somebody referred to a paedophile who was being sentenced on the television as, well, it's just the same as you. So that involved quite a lengthy conversation, but it was basically about consent's kind of an important difference, distinct about many other issues. So I've dealt with all of these tropes. I've faced up to them. I've marched against Section 28. I marched and even performed one year at Pride. However, since 2019, I mistakenly thought that my experience of safeguarding in the NHS, my years of activism in response to the HIV and AIDS crisis, and my recent role as the chair of Fife Pride would help me bridge the gap between trans rights activists and women's groups. But in my bringing to the fore questions that hitherto would have been routine to any policy development, I was targeted and quite wrongly labelled, amongst many other things, a transphobe. And the reason is because I would not submit unquestioningly to gender ideology. And what I've witnessed has been horrific. People who call themselves straight allies or queer-identifying straight people have quite literally pushed gay men and lesbians out of our own movement. I can think of no clearer an example than Alexander Bramman, a gay man who was bullied out of Manchester Pride by a straight woman. In all the years I have been out, the worst homophobia I have experienced has been in the last 2 years, and much of it has happened in this place. And despite formally raising those concerns, it has not been taken seriously and was simply not addressed. Homophobia is back, and after all the years we spent battling down those barriers, it's back at the behest of Stonewall, and it's draped in a pride flag. Because if you remove sex, there can be no homosexual. Sex matters. It is a defining characteristic of who I am. Just saying that has seen me branded a hate figure, targeted for harassment, referred to by an honourable member in this place as a homophobic blank. You can fill it in yourself. Yeah. One of the most contentious issues centres on how the word woman is defined in law. Does it mean human adult female, or should it be broader than that and include NATO males who decide to live as women and transition? Clarity on this carries significance for how we understand other protected characteristics within the Equalities Act, including same-sex attracted people, and whether a trans woman who is attracted to a natal female is indeed a lesbian. The ruling from the Inner House of the Court of Session last week was unequivocal. For the purposes of the protected characteristics of sex in the 2010 Equalities Act, a woman is a natal female of any age, a man is a natal male of any age, and the rights and protections of the trans community are rightly provided under the discrete protected characteristic for gender reassignment. But how this decision interacts with GRA reform in Scotland remains to be seen. But as sex and gender are now considered very separate terms, this may require further legal attention. These issues matter, and this legal clarity is of enormous significance. And I want to pay tribute to Marion, Trina, Susan and everyone at For Women Scotland for their courage, determination and success. I have demonstrated my resilience against outrageous behaviour over these past 2 years, and I want to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Brigg and Gould, Chair of the Anti-Semitism APPG, and Danny Stone, Chief Executive of the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, for their confidence, support and guidance. These impacts ripple well beyond me. Women are being targeted on social media and in the workplace for holding a view which is now an established point of law. They have been told that this view was invalid by the First Minister of Scotland. I hold a deep sadness that people I have worked closely with have used their influence as LGBT campaigners and politicians to bully, harass and silence women. What is now clear is that this is a breach of equalities legislation, and it must cease. For all the years I marched, cared for sick friends and dying friends, raised awareness in the workplace, in schools and in my community, my greatest allies have always been women. My mum, my friend Lynn, my friend Fee, my friends Anne and Susan and many, many others. They stood by me through thick and thin, and I will not abandon them now. Now that we have legal clarity over the meaning of sex, we must find a way to tackle this matter and improve the lives of trans people and reform GRA. But as both Baroness Faulkner, the current chair, and Trevor Phillips, the founding chair of the HRC, have made clear in recent days, equalities is a matter of mutual respect, balance and compromise, and not something that can be dictated by loud, uncompromising voices. The era of no debate is firmly over. It's time to heal deep, deep wounds and focus on a policy that delivers meaningful improvements to the lives and safety of the trans population whilst respecting the rights of others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to discuss this petition on behalf of over 250 constituents who signed it. In its reply to the petition we're debating today, the government states, "We will make the gender recognition certificate process kinder and more straightforward." If I'm understanding the government's response correctly, they recognise that the current process can be distressing and humiliating, and that more should be done to streamline what can feel like a tortuous administrative process. I would like to therefore use the time I have today to ask what concrete steps the government is taking to ease that burden. For example, the government said, and it's already been referred to, that it would reduce the fee from £140 to a nominal amount. That reduction of the fee to £5 has now happened and is a step in the right direction, but there's still a cost attached to acquiring all the documentation required. But the reduction in the fee itself should be welcomed. The government also says it will streamline the administrative process and cut bureaucracy by enabling applications via gov.uk. And as the honourable member said earlier, and I agree with her, I question whether enabling applications to be made online can seriously be considered streamlining the process. It isn't removing a requirement or reducing the number of boxes an applicant needs to tick. It is instead adding the need to find a scanner and upload all the same evidence and all the same documentation. To imply digitising the process as somehow streamlining it is disingenuous. We must also ensure that we're not excluding those who don't have access to the necessary technology. So what other steps is the government taking to make the process kinder and more straightforward? As we know, the current system requires you to be a certain age, to live in gender for 2 years, to obtain 2 medical reports, one of which must confirm a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. You have to make a statutory declaration that you intend to live as this gender for the rest of your life, and to submit your application to a gender recognition panel who you as an applicant never get to meet. Reams of evidence need to be provided to the panel to prove your case. These current requirements are prohibitive, as evidenced by the tiny number of trans people currently in possession of a GRC, as has already been referenced. So in order to streamline the process, is the government, for example, considering removing the need for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria? This requirement implies that being trans is an illness, because it is worth noting that in September 2020, the British Medical Association called for trans people to be recognised for who they are without a medical diagnosis. And it's also out of step with both the NHS and the Department of Health and Social Care definitions, who do not see gender dysphoria as a mental illness. Then there's the opaqueness of the panel itself. Applicants get no explanation if they're rejected, and this rejection is by a panel that does not ever meet them and doesn't have to provide any real justification for their decision. Another barrier is the requirement for spousal consent. This is something the Women and Equalities Select Committee acknowledged in their report, published on the 21st of December last year. That report also recommended that the government should bring back an action plan for reform to the GRA within 12 weeks. Specifically, in relation to the spousal consent provision, the requirement to live in the acquired gender, and the diagnosis of gender dysphoria. We are now 9 weeks into that 12-week timeframe, so I asked the Minister what progress has been made on such an action plan and what progress has been made in making this process kinder. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a real pleasure to serve under your chairship today. And I'd also like to thank the member for Carshalton and Wallington for setting a very positive scene this evening. And I'd also like to thank the 438 Liverpool Riverside constituents who took the time to sign the petition. And as a member of the Women and Equalities Committee, I've heard significant evidence about the failures of the Gender Recognition Act to support trans and non-binary people in their legal transitions. And instead, they're faced with highly intrusive, medicalised, stigmatising procedures. And I'm proud to have played a role in this report with the amendments I moved to reaffirm the principles of inclusion and diversity in our spaces and services, demanding clear guidance and best practice examples around how to prevent and challenge discrimination against trans and gender non-conforming people. And these changes and the guidance are long overdue. In response, the government must take decisive action now to change its destructive approach around trans rights, whipping up a culture war against the safety, security and support of females with that of trans and gender non-conforming people, when really one can never be achieved without the other. And in the 13 years since the GRA was first introduced, very few people have applied for a gender recognition certificate, and less than 5,000 have completed the process successfully. With estimates of the UK trans and non-binary population from between 200 and 500,000, there are clearly significant barriers for people navigating the gender recognition process. And several other countries, including Denmark, Ireland, Norway, have brought in a statutory gender recognition process based on self-declaration, which has been recognised as best practice by a number of our own trade unions and prominent trans rights campaign groups here in the UK, which Labour will implement once in government. And such a process would be far quicker, more transparent and more accessible than our current processes. And over 80% of the 100,000 submissions to the government GRA consultation call the requirement for a medical report as part of the current gender recognition process as intrusive, costly and humiliating. And in 2019, the World Health Organization announced that it no longer considers gender dysphoria a mental health issue. And there is groundswell of support for reform along these lines, even amongst the most polarised groups, as we heard time and again during the Women and Equalities Select Committee inquiry. As an absolute bare minimum, the government must take immediate steps to remove from the gender recognition process the requirement to live in the acquired gender for a set period of time, the medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria and the spousal consent provision. These areas have overwhelming support for removal from the process of obtaining a gender recognition certificate and would go a huge way towards removing some of the most stigmatising, humiliating and disempowering barriers for people legally changing their gender. It is absolutely damning that this government has done nothing but dither and delay, so far refused to engage with these simple and practical steps 4 years after its own consultation. As our report detailed, their reluctance to engage and their behaviour in whipping up a culture war has caused an immense amount of damage. It is now highly concerning that recent reports have seen the EHRC politically interfere in Scottish reform of legislation relating to trans rights, and the Commission has reportedly met privately with anti-trans groups, and employees have quit the organisation, citing its anti-LGBT culture. And while I'm proud we put forward such strong recommendations in our inquiry, they're only worth the paper they're written on if we have bold and meaningful commitments from the Government and Equalities Commission to take them forward. And given their behaviour so far, it's clear we have a long way to go. But what is also clear is that the tide of popular opinion against them, trans rights, are human rights, and we must continue to fight for the rights of trans and gender non-conforming people to ensure they live and thrive in dignity. Thank you.
Chair, and to hear so many members speak with passion on both sides of this debate. In 2015, the Oireachtas, and for those who don't know what it is, it's the Parliament of Ireland, enacted the Gender Recognition Act for Ireland and subsequently sought review of that said act, which was published in 2018. And I'm minded of the words of the chair of the review, Moni Griffith. Equal recognition sends a strong message to LGBT plus people that we are equal citizens. We are valued and we belong. As well as equal status, it also addresses the practical realities of citizens' lives, such as protection for families and access to identification. It is clear, I think, from all sides of this debate, there is a clear necessity for reform of gender recognition. At least for me, it is one in which the pathologising of trans people is an outdated medical practice which seeks to preserve trans identity as a mental illness. It requires medical intervention. Secondly, it determines that the body of a trans person requires medical and surgical change that requires extensive medical evidence, when in reality it's not required. Thirdly, the present situation fails to meet internationally recognised standards that so many other states, some of which have been profoundly socially conservative, have embraced. And again, I'm mindful not only of Ireland, but of Malta. So we must also accept there are no rights, new rights, being introduced for trans men and women. For example, the Gender Recognition does not affect sports competitions. Both the Equality Act, at least from my perspective, and Gender Recognition Act provide that to ensure safe and fair competition in gender-segregated sports, governing bodies can set their own restrictions on participation by trans people, regardless of the trans person's legal gender recognition status. Gender recognition does not give a person the right to compete in sports that apply this restriction. This will not change. The Act does not affect any NHS clinical decision-making process about minimum age and other criteria for approving a trans person to receive any medical interventions, including hormone blockers, cross-sex hormones, or any surgeries. These criteria are based on international clinically best practice and are set out, at least in the Scottish perspective, and the Minister may want to look them up, in the NHS Scotland Gender Reassignment Protocol. Decisions are taken by doctors together with the person based on clinical judgment. Gender recognition reform does not affect, at least from my perspective, criminal justice system. The placement and management of trans people in custody, as I think the Minister will agree, is based on a careful, risk-assessed decision-making. A gender recognition certificate does not give a prisoner right to move to accommodation for the other sex. Provision will continue to exist for prisoners who are legally female, whether trans or not, to be held in the male estate if necessary for the safety of other prisoners or for their own safety. And I do see the Minister nodding their head. Let me also say that nor do I believe that it affects the rights, women's rights, or trans people's rights in the Equality Act. The Equality Act sets out when services can lawfully be single-sex only. I think we've heard on some sides, both sides of the debate, that been argued and put forward. It also says that the general rule is that trans people should be allowed to access to single-sex services matching the gender they live in, except that they can be treated differently where that is proportionate means to legitimate aim or excluded in exceptional circumstances. Whether or not the trans person has a gender recognition or not is not part of the rule. None of this will change. It's clear that much of the debate regarding gender reform, I think, has sadly been hijacked on a range of extremes, from the politics of biology to the inability to hear the concerns of those who, for various reasons, may be opposed to elements or to the entirety of the reform being considered. That does not lessen the concern, worry and fear of trans men and women who seek only to live as their true self, exercising their own individual self-determination. I think we also need to recognise the conflicting, appalling misogyny that many women, including many women within this Parliament, face by using the gender recognition debate to ridicule and marginalise the trans community, notably via the politics of biology. And I must say to the member for Penistone and Stockbridge, I'm mindful of the words of Norman Cohn, who takes the question of nature and the politics of biology head on. Norman reminds us, nature demands inequality, hierarchy, subordination of the inferior to the superior, but human history is a series of revolts against the natural order, leading to ever greater, to ever greater equality. Actually, no, I will give way to the Honourable Lady. She is taking up my time now.
I'd be interested to know how he thinks politics and biology interact.
I think the Honourable Lady acquainted herself with her notion of politics and biology in her own speech. So let me say again, it's leading to ever greater egalitarianism. I must say it's my only hope that the government, from the UK perspective, that by embracing greater egalitarianism, that it will reap the benefits as a society which would be more capable of supporting the marginalised, more capable of combating misogyny and transphobia, and for once recognising that the greatest threat to our society is not trans men or women, but those who see the world as binary and limited, a narrow society in which the lived experience of the elite dominates the diverse and complex lives of the many.
Thank you very much, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And as many have said already, the discussion and debate around trans rights has become divisive and fractious. But I think it's really important that we state it really shouldn't be. It absolutely shouldn't be. It should be a debate that is rooted in evidence, yes, but also in compassion. And I think others have also mentioned the word love, and I couldn't agree more. And love for all sides, including people I don't necessarily agree with. In my surgeries, I've spoken to constituents from the trans community, parents of trans children, and also to those who describe themselves as gender critical. And in fact spent many hours in a Zoom room with someone from the gender critical community, someone who's non-binary, and myself, also from the LGBT community. And we sat and we chewed it out. We spoke about everything and tried to get to the bottom of where we agreed, which was most of it, and where we didn't. And that, I'm afraid, is where some of the rub lies. One of it was an understanding that our understanding of the words gender and sex differed. For those on the gender critical side, the two were different words. And for me, they're frankly synonyms. It's just that one got used more recently, and it could well have been replaced in the first original 2004 Act. So I think we just need to appreciate that those sides are valid. They are entirely allowed their point of view. But I would like to put it on record that I profoundly disagree with much of the gender critical point of view, and especially those arguments that in any way imply that trans people are a danger to society and women, because they are not. Drawing false equivalence between trans people and predatory sex offenders, which I have to say is where a lot of the arguments have ended up over the years that I've been debating this, is, I don't think, doing justice to many people who do have sincerely held views around same-sex spaces and whatever. That's not where they want that debate to go, but there are some who draw those inferences, and we need to call that out as just wrong. Now, the Gender Recognition Act is not fit for purpose, and I'm glad that the government does seem to recognise that in its modest reforms that it's intending to make. And rather than get down and bogged down in the legalese and the whatabouteries right now, actually, I wanted to give whatever time I had over to the voices of trans people and the families of trans people. So I contacted some of my constituents and I said, right, you've got 150 words, what do you want to say? And so, Christopher, I want to make it clear, I have not changed a single word of what they've written. The first is a mother of a trans child. The bullying and harassment my child suffered at school took over our lives for a year and a half. I was constantly attending hearings, talking to the school, and making arrangements to move schools. But I would have gone to any lengths necessary to protect my child. I have a background in education, and I knew what I could do to make that school listen. It worries me that there are young trans people who don't have supportive adults to help them through. Current legislation means young trans people have no legal protection from being outed or harassed. I don't understand what good reason anyone could have for failing to protect a vulnerable minority in this way. For my child, once they turned 18 and were able to get a GRC, it gave them the chance to go through life without fear of being outed. That means having a reasonable chance to live free from discrimination and harassment. And many have said, what is the point of a GRC? Well, for that child, it was everything. Another constituent, a trans woman, told me, I knew when I was 4 years old that I was trans. I grew up during Section 28, believed it was not okay to come out, and that I would be bullied if I did. I began to medically transition 9 years ago, and still don't have a gender recognition certificate. The bureaucracy, money, and invasiveness are significant barriers. I don't think changing your legal gender needs to be as simple as changing your address at a bank. I understand there are processes that need to be in place, but there is a balance to be struck. And we cannot ignore non-binary people simply because they don't fit into our current structures. I work with young trans people in my youth groups, and the real issues for them are mental health and access to gender identity services. Earlier this year, I lost one of my young people to suicide. We need reform of the GRA, but we also need to understand that transitioning isn't just about changing your name on a bank statement. The government needs to listen to the trans community and reform services to make sure we don't lose any more of our young people. Reforming the Gender Recognition Act won't solve all of these problems. It won't reduce waiting times for gender identity services. It won't lessen the impact of gender dysphoria or eliminate discrimination and prejudice, but it will make it easier for a person to apply for legal recognition of their gender. The current process is long, medicalised, and intrusive. Improving this process builds a legal framework that respects trans people and acknowledges their lived experience. So Christopher, my desire as a Liberal is that every person in our country, whoever they are, feels not just accepted, but celebrated and supported by society to live fulfilled, productive lives. But the fact is, for far too many trans people, this country is moving in the wrong direction. So let's properly reform the Gender Recognition Act, rather than tinkering around the edges, which is the current plan of this government. It's a broken system. It needs fixing. And I would simply urge the government to think again.
Thank you very much, Sir Christopher, and thanks also to Sir George, for both of you chairing this meeting. I'd like to also thank the member for Carshalton and Wallington. I know that he commented on the fact that he needed to be brave to bring this forward, or words to that effect, and I appreciate that he did choose to do that today. It was indeed a brave thing to do. Sir Christopher, this is a really important issue, and we must make change, especially for the 500,000 or thereabouts trans people in the UK and their friends and family. What's proposed is a small administrative reform that will have a huge and lasting impact on the lives of trans people in the UK. Clearly, there's a different system in Scotland to obtain a GRC, not least we don't have the spousal veto in place. But the problems with the two current systems are largely the same, and the changes that need to happen in the systems are therefore broadly similar. In Scotland, we're undertaking reform, and legislation will be brought forward very soon about this. I'm acutely aware of my privilege as I stand here making this speech. I'm going to do my best to amplify the voices and concerns of those I've had the privilege to listen to over the last few years. But this is not a substitute for hearing trans voices directly. We don't have trans people in Parliament. And as was mentioned earlier, some of our MPs are unaware of ever having met a trans person, even though they most certainly have. They're just unaware of that. And therefore, you know, people who have never met or spoken to or heard from a trans person are not the right people to be making decisions about how gender reform should work. Trans voices are significantly outnumbered in the media on any issue relating to trans rights. And this must change, but until it does, it's incumbent on those of us with platforms to make the case for reform on behalf of our constituents and on behalf of other trans people across the UK. The current system for obtaining a gender recognition certificate is a failure. The UK government estimates there are 200 to 500,000 trans people living in the UK, but fewer than 6,000 of them have obtained a gender recognition certificate. Those who manage have got to jump through unreasonable hoops in order to get a GRC, and they're in the tiniest minority. The process is bureaucratic, it takes too long, and it includes many outdated and unreasonable requirements. You've got to put in reams and reams of paper in order to do it. And as was mentioned, maybe this is because people don't want a gender recognition certificate. It is not the case. I have got a passport because I recognise the rights that the passport gives me. I applied for that passport because I did not have to give a detailed description of my genitals in order to get those rights that come along with the passport. In terms of getting a gender recognition certificate, the intrusiveness of that procedure is what puts a significant number of people off, as well as the bureaucracy and the fact that there is no appeal process and no ability to find out what has gone wrong if your application is rejected. Changing this system has got no impact on the ability for trans people to correct their gender on their passport or on their driving licence. It simply and exclusively applies to birth certificates and around issues with pensions. Although it's a small change, it's important for the human rights and the dignity of a significant minority of our population. Birth certificates impact on death and marriage certificates. Imagine approaching the end of your life knowing that your death certificate was going to have the wrong gender on it, that your friends and family were going to have to live with your death certificate having the wrong gender on it, and spending the last moments of your life worrying about that death certificate being incorrect. I think we need to change for that reason alone, no matter for the other compelling reasons that we've heard. We've talked already and we've heard about the number of systems that have got self-ID. I want to talk, because this was specifically mentioned in the terms of the petition, about the growing numbers of individuals identifying as non-binary. Like most feminists, gender stereotypes and gendered expectations have always bothered me. I can entirely understand how and why people come to the conclusion that they don't comfortably fit in either a male or a female box. None of the governmental proposals I've seen go far enough or sometimes even acknowledge the existence of non-binary people, and this has got to change. If we do want this legislation to be fit for the future, we need to consider the needs of future generations. Many more young people are uncomfortable with established gender stereotypes and moulds. We must allow non-binary people, therefore, to identify as non-binary. Sir Christopher, the extreme level of misinformation and lies being peddled about GRA reform has created an incredibly fertile ground for hate and abuse. The increase in the number of hate crimes that we've seen with a trans aggravator neatly illustrates this. We must be more honest. We must not allow those in positions of power to mislead the public about the impacts of these proposed reforms. The reforms will only affect birth certificates and pensions, not access to spaces, not passports, not names, not driving licence, not access to surgical interventions, not swimming pool changing rooms, not prisons, not hospital wards, and not sports. All of those are dealt with under either the Equality Act or other individual acts. And I don't understand how people keep going on about swimming pools. I have been in so many swimming pools with my kids, and almost all of them have got mixed changing rooms. Almost every single swimming pool has got mixed changing rooms. It's already the case that this is a thing, and they've all got cubicles as well. In the last week, I've been approached by 3 50-plus women who've wished to speak to me about trans rights, who've approached me about the issue, not an issue that I've raised with them. All 3 of them had read about the proposed changes, and all 3 of them were baffled by the extreme reaction to a simple administrative change. One of them, who has got daughters, said to me, people should be allowed to live their lives, and it makes no difference to me what it says on someone's birth certificate. So, Christopher, that is the reality, but I want to end on a quote that makes clear why we need change. This is from Mr. Elliot, and it was submitted to the Women Equalities Committee when they did a call for evidence. It says, I had to send several private documents to a group of strangers at the cost of £140 to let them decide whether I am man enough to marry as a husband, be declared a father to my future children, or simply die with the respect of being remembered as a man. I was a boy, and I am now a man, and for 6 years I have been living that truth, outwardly and proud, with no rejection of this fact from my loved ones. Yet I could still be denied this truth, my truth, by strangers. Sir Christopher, we need change. The Gender Recognition Act needs to be reformed.
Before calling Lloyd Russell-Moore, can I say that there's, I think, 15 minutes each for the spokesman. Sorry? Who's next? Oh, I'm so sorry. Kirsten Oswald. No? Oh, sorry, it's Kirsten Oswald. I wasn't here at the beginning. Sorry, I didn't know. So before calling the SNP spokesman, can I say that I think there's 15, if we have 15 minutes for the SNP spokesman maximum and 15 minutes for the official opposition spokesman maximum, and then that will give a little bit more than 15 minutes for the minister and a short response to that debate. Yes? So it's Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship and to take part in this important debate today. And it is an important debate, and I'm grateful to everybody who signed the petition, including all of those who live in my constituency, and also to everyone who's taken time to engage on this issue. And I wondered how this debate would go. I suspect all of us did. I think it's possibly gone the way that I would have thought. It's been a mixed bag, but one thing that I would reflect on is that I don't think that any one of us would disagree, as the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Walton set out at the beginning, that it seems too often to me that there is far too much heat and precious little light on issues like GRA reform. And that doesn't do anyone any good. It's a real shame. These people who are directly impacted by this issue and those people who are concerned with this issue deserve to have us conduct ourselves with dignity and with respect. And in any case, the petition doesn't really ask much. It's asking for a simplified and more dignified process, allowing, as the Honourable Member for Reigate said, people to get on with their lives. But the process now is degrading, it's intrusive, it's traumatic,
Indeed, the UK Government Equalities Office accepts, it would seem to me from its response, the need for the processes to be, as they put it, kinder and more straightforward. But the reality is that their plans are not going to achieve a process that's particularly kinder or more straightforward, and what the UK Government describe somewhat mysteriously as balance could perhaps most charitably be described as a fudge at best. Because what we're looking at here is a necessary change to make the lives of trans people that little bit easier. And it would be a real missed opportunity and frankly difficult to fathom if that opportunity is avoided or fudged. And that matters because at the heart of this is the issue of trans rights, the rights of a minority group who we know, we've heard today, have experienced a surge in hate crime, up 76% plus over the last couple of years, and who live with the knowledge of an increasingly hostile narrative in many places. And everyone, whatever your views on this issue, loses out because of that. Now, like the Honourable Member for the City of Durham, whose speech I very much enjoyed, I am a feminist. I'm a middle-aged feminist at that, so I've been round the houses a few times, and I'm really focused on the rights of women and the wrongs done to women and the need to always stand up for women. These things are not negotiable for me, but my support and my party's support for trans rights are too, and that in no way diminishes my commitment to always stand up for women. It certainly doesn't conflict with continued strong commitments to uphold the rights and protections that women and girls have under the 2010 Equality Act. And in fact, if we look at the world beyond this place right now, the importance for all of us in standing up for equality and fair treatment and human rights has never been more critical. And indeed, in Gender, Scotland's feminist policy organisation has also been clear that making this process easier will not impinge negatively on women's rights. And I say all of that because I want to be clear that I absolutely support the need to do better in supporting what the trans community need to happen. But I do appreciate and understand that some people have a sincerely held view that's different to mine. And I'll always listen carefully and respectfully to views expressed carefully and respectfully. I think it's a really important principle. And indeed, the Scottish Government has engaged in listening via the extensive consultations that have been undertaken, and to a greater extent on this particular issue than on any other that I can think of. And that's important because we have to get this right. We have to deliver a system of gender recognition that both complies with international human rights law and delivers a fairer, more straightforward means of gaining legal recognition. And I note that the Women and Equalities Committee said about the proposed changes in Scotland, this could be a move in the right direction. And I think that that's absolutely true. But before we get there, the situation as it stands, the reason people are concerned with this bears some reflection. There's obviously no requirement for anyone to have a gender recognition certificate, but it's surely easy to understand why someone would want one. But at the moment, only between 1% and 3% of trans people in the UK have a GRC. So the current approach, with its focus on medicalisation, on very burdensome bureaucracy, very opaque guidelines, as these statistics tell us, is not working. And the responses to both the UK Government and Scottish Government consultations tell us that people recognise this and support the need for reform. In fact, the recent Savanta Comres poll in Scotland also found majority support, including from a majority of women and majority of under 54s. And perhaps there's no wonder that that's the case, because who among us would want to deal with life events that necessarily come with admin, things like marriage, new jobs, pensions, even death, as we heard about very eloquently from my colleague, the Honourable Member for Aberdeen North, set out. Imagine dealing with these big life-changing issues with the knowledge that our paperwork could be wrong. And even describing it that way, frankly, seems a very inadequate way of explaining the worry and distress that that could cause. So the petitioner's desire for the system to be simplified is very understandable. And when you start to drill down, it becomes even more so. I spoke recently to someone who'd had to produce paperwork in quantities that would fill a whole box making the UK government's suggested solution of an online system somewhat difficult to comprehend. And that's without even getting into the England and Wales requirement for what's known as a spousal declaration. In what other area of our lives would that possibly be remotely acceptable? And the UK government have said that they'll drop costs, which is welcome, but the reality, of course, is that the cost of the reports and so on that would be required put the cost right back up and more. So it's not making it more accessible at all. And that's before you even start to look into the very difficult issues of medical processes, of medicalisation, of personal upheaval, social challenges, the significant financial burden. And then you're faced with the arbitrary decision of a panel of strangers potentially telling you, in essence, that you don't know who you are. So on any examination, the system at present is not working, as my honourable friend for Paisley in Renfrewshire South said. It's unnecessarily medicalised, it's bureaucratic, it's traumatic, and it's simply not fair. And that's why a move to a more straightforward, self-declaratory system is needed, and it makes sense. And again, to be clear, because like others, and we've heard this today, I've read some statements that are simply false, particularly online. This reform would not allow anyone to simply get up one day and decide to be a different gender for some nefarious purpose and then revert. That is just not true. The proposals laid out by the Scottish Government actually mean obtaining a gender recognition certificate will remain a serious and lifelong commitment, including a period of 3 months living in your chosen gender, a statutory declaration, a further 3-month period of reflection, and applicants would still be subject to criminal proceedings for making a false declaration and application. It's not something anyone could enter into lightly. And of course, by way of comparison, we could reflect, as we've heard today, on some of the experiences in places like Ireland, Malta, Norway, Denmark, and many more. This is working without any drama. Life is just more straightforward. So I hope that in the coming periods, as Scottish Government plans progress, that actually allows people to hear the reality of what is planned, and I hope that that will be helpful. And of course, what they'll also hear is that the Scottish Government's draft bill does not include any new rights for trans people, and they'll hear that changes won't affect the rights or protections that women currently have under the Equality Act, as my honourable friend, the member for Western Bartonshire, very clearly explained. Because all of these rights, the rights of women and of trans people, must be protected, including the protection of women's safe spaces. And I say that because, unfortunately, the issue that I think lies beneath a great deal of the heat around this discussion is the fact that predatory men who attack women exist, but bitter experience shows us that they don't need a gender recognition certificate to do that. They can do that, and they do that just now. So the problem is predatory men. The problem is criminals. It's not trans people. And we're doing everyone a disservice if we conflate the two and allow ourselves to be diverted from this reform. To do that would also be to encourage what's already an increasing intolerance in some quarters, and a narrative that makes me very uncomfortable. It takes me back to being a teenager in the 1980s, and the Honourable Member for Wallasey spoke very eloquently about this. The public conversation back then about homosexuality was poisonous, it was corrosive, and it was so damaging. We cannot go back there on trans issues, and we need to be very clear that we won't go back there. Before I conclude, I think that one of the most important points made today was by the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, who pointed out that we're having this debate, and it's really important we are having it. I very much welcome that. But we're having it here today. There are no trans people participating in this debate, and we need to reflect on that too, because I think that if we could hear the lived experience, the voices of trans people as part of this respectful dialogue, I think that that would be very, very helpful. But, Sir Christopher, if I can close by saying that we are all the better, whatever our different views and opinions, for being more open, more inclusive, appreciating that all our rights are important. And it's no surprise, perhaps, that I see all of this through a prism of how a better country could be. I think that for me, the better country that I know is coming in Scotland will be a more open, a more inclusive, a more tolerant and equal country where no one's identity is up for debate and where all of our rights matter. And it's time for that change.
Lisa Dodds.
Thank you, Sir Christopher, and it's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and it's also a pleasure to be speaking in this discussion. I want to thank the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for leading it, and of course I also want to thank all of those who signed the petition, including 400 of my own constituents from Oxford East. I think we all have to recognise that these topics are very sensitive and they're very important, and discussion of them needs to be conducted with respect and with compassion. Solutions will be found through people working together. They won't be found through threats and intimidation in any direction. They'll be found through learning, not lecturing, as my friend for the City of Durham quite rightly said. And I have to say, Sir Christopher, that I don't like descriptions of these topics as a debate, because I think that suggests to some trans people that the fact they're trans is somehow part of a debate, and that's not right. But I think also it suggests that there are two sides here that are at it hammer and tongs, that don't have anything in common, and that we can't find those solutions. I don't believe that's right. I've got the optimism, actually, of my friend for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, and I think where there has been discussion, where there's been disagreement, very often that relates to assumptions around the impact of different measures. My experience has been very similar, actually, to that of my constituency neighbour for Oxford West and Abingdon, that once those assumptions are unpacked, we can really get into the nuts and bolts of the implications of different forms of legislative change. And that surely is what we need to be doing in this discussion. Now, my party, the Labour Party, is committed to ensuring that trans people who do face, as we've talked about, persistent and growing discrimination in society, that they can live their lives with equality, dignity and respect, that everyone can do this, and we will resist attempts to roll back hard-won rights. And this discussion must take place on the basis of the evidence. I have to say I've felt at certain points we've slid a little bit away from that evidence in this discussion. First of all, of course, there is accompanying material to the Equality Act already. There is a code of practice produced by the HRC already about how the single-sex exemptions should work. That was produced with the GRA already in existence, so there is already that corpus there. I think it's important we recognise that. I think it's important also that we don't conflate gender with sex. We did slide into that quite a number of times during this discussion, and we also mustn't conflate gender reassignment with sexuality. I also felt like that was taking place at certain points. Now, when we have that discussion on the basis of evidence, I think the way forward is very clear. We do need reform of the Gender Recognition Act. It must include a process of self-identification, and we must continue to support the implementation of the Equality Act, including the single-sex exemptions. Now, my party is very proud of the Equality Act. It was passed by the last Labour government. We stand by it, including those provisions on the protected characteristics of gender reassignment and of sex and those single-sex exemptions. And that Equality Act, as is clear from that accompanying material, from the Code of Practice and so forth, it assumes the inclusion of trans people with or without a GRC, as we've been talking about, and protects them from discrimination while allowing for specific circumstances where the single-sex exemption is applied. That's the right approach. That's the one my party supports. And we believe that the Gender Recognition Act itself does need reform And that reform is a narrow issue. I couldn't agree more with what my right honourable friend for Wallasey said in this regard. As the government's own consultation on this recognised, the current process is, and I quote from that consultation, too bureaucratic, expensive and intrusive. That must change, and that's why the Act needs to be updated. Now, it's been more than 3 years since ministers said they'd make it easier for trans people to achieve legal gender recognition, that they'd make that process less intrusive. But as we've been discussing over the last few hours, all we've seen have been very, very limited changes that don't make that difference. And I couldn't have agreed more with the description provided by my friend for Brighton Kemp Town about the government's approach here. They promised there would be change, but they have simply not delivered on that promise after many years. So I want to ask the Minister directly, if I may, Sir Christopher, does he genuinely believe there's no case for additional reform here? Now, when the Minister for Women and Equalities announced there would be no further reform of the GRA, she said she believed in individual liberty and in the humanity and dignity of every person. Well, can the Minister tell us how leaving in place a system under which a trans person still requires the consent of their spouse in 2022 to obtain a certificate is giving that person individual liberty and dignity? And I think the words here from the Right Honourable Member for Reigate were incredibly powerful about how dehumanising that is. I would also like to hear the Minister's response to the situations described by my honourable friends for Wallasey and for Brighton Kemp Town, the Kafkaesque situations that people land in when trying to obtain certificates. Can he tell the House how he thinks that the minimal changes introduced by the government really will make that transitioning process substantively less intrusive? And, in fact, have those minimal changes even begun? 18 months on from the promise to digitise this process, it's not clear that anything has actually happened. Doesn't seem to have been that change. Of course, this is in the context where we've seen slow action and even reverses in a number of other areas. I think it's important when we should acknowledge that there is cross-party agreement. The government's LGBT+ action plan included many measures that my side of the House strongly agreed with. But of course, since it was announced last May, when the Minister for Women and Equalities was asked to explain why there hadn't been any progress updates, she suggested the plan had just been abandoned. She said it's probably because there's a new government in place under the leadership of Boris Johnson. So is that plan still there, or is it not there? Because, of course, that plan covers also many of the issues that we've been talking about today, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to discrimination, when it comes to hate crime, and also, of course, when it comes to conversion therapy, where we see that huge loophole introduced by the government around consent. So, Sir Christopher, this has been an important discussion. I'd like to thank everybody in this House and beyond it who's entered into these discussions in good faith and in the spirit of trying to find solutions. And we believe that there is a clear solution when it comes to that reform of the GRA, as I've just set out. But it's really important, amidst all this talk about legislative reform, of systems and processes, that we should never lose sight of the fact that we're talking about people, about people's rights, people's lives, people's very sense of who they are. And I think my friend for Cardiff South and Penarth made that very, very clear in his comments. This is about people. If we're talking about people who are transitioning to a different gender, we're talking about people who've suffered domestic abuse and need somewhere safe to process that. We're always talking about people. As my friend for Liverpool Riverside said, we must not pit different groups against each other. And sadly, we have seen far too much of that around these critical issues. We need compassion, and we need a government that puts compassion at the heart of its response. That is what my party is determined to do. Thank you.
Minister, you've got up to about 25 minutes. Minister.
And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And also could I thank my honourable friend for Carshalton and Wallington for his tone, and I expected nothing less from the way he approached it. It is what is known as his thoughtful and gentle approach to many thorny issues. I do believe that today's debate has been a reminder of the strength of feeling around this issue. And it is one which, since I took up the post, is one that I've been increasingly perplexed why we can't focus on the people. I've said from day one that I'm tired of a debate about body parts because it dehumanises individuals. It dehumanises the people that are going through what is not an easy decision, and it is most certainly not an easy process. And I want to be absolutely clear that this government firmly believes that LGBT plus people, and I reiterate the T, should be free to live and prosper in modern Britain. And we are committed to ensuring that they can do so. We want people to live their life free from discrimination, from prejudice and hate. We want to ensure everyone has the same opportunities in life. And if I can't necessarily address all of the issues, but I have been making copious notes. And whilst we may not agree on some of the fundamental reforms that the petition was seeking, I have heard very loud and clear the many issues, particularly of process, that we need to address. And one of the issues that I have committed to taking up since I came into the Equalities brief for LGBT+, was to ensure that we lift up the bonnet, if you like, and find out where the process is not working. It cannot be right that people have to wait 3 to 5 years for an appointment at a gender identity clinic, let alone then wait for going through any form of surgical intervention, if that's what they choose to do, or mental health support, or access to hormones from their GPs. It cannot be right that we have some GPs refusing to issue hormones on the NHS because of what they believe to have their concerns. And those are some of the issues that we can address. So we may not be able to agree on a fundamental reform of GRA down towards known as self-identification. And many members have talked about the fact that that is a misnomer and people don't understand what it does mean. But in terms of making the whole process kinder, gentler and more supportive, more patient-led, and I hate the word patient as well, but client-led, whatever term we use, it needs to put the trans person at the heart of getting this right. And that's one of the things that I'm committed to getting right as much as I possibly can. And we do want... Of course.
Approach in terms of kindness. So the government have said that they won't take away the requirement for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria or a mental illness given by 2 doctors. How on earth, given what he said today, can that be a kind process?
I think the Right Honourable Lady jumped to the bottom of the page. Because actually the government recognises the reference disorder in the Act is outdated and dehumanising and will be removed. So I do want to particularly ensure that we remember the people involved. Many people have talked about the people that are impacted by our debate, and again the conversation has become too toxic. But equally, we also need, and bizarrely on toxic, I've been described as a misogynistic, self-hating gay because I support trans rights, which is bizarre. And so I have to say that the whole ability to have a rational conversation on some of these issues has just passed too many people by. And we do have that responsibility to ensure that we make our decisions based on fact. And again, I'm sorry, I'm digressing, but I do feel quite passionately. I must correct this completely wrong view that a trans woman can be placed in a prison of her choice. That is simply not true. 3 years ago, the Ministry of Justice changed the rules, and now a prisoner will be placed in the estate that is most suited to their position, what their status is on the transition journey, their treatments, and in terms of what their physicality is like. It's not just simply hello, I'm a woman and I'd like to be in a woman's prison, please. It simply is not true. And sometimes it's important not minimising the concerns people have of what has happened in the past, but it's equally, if we're going to try not to minimise people's concerns, it's equally right that we actually make sure that we base our arguments on fact.
I welcome what my old friend has just said, but isn't the critical point of that is that the Ministry of Justice has in place a framework for risk assessing each individual who identifies in an opposite gender. And in using that risk assessment tool, then people can be allocated into the correct prison that suits their needs and the needs of their fellow prisoners. And doesn't that really get to the heart of what we really ought to be getting to here, which is actually for service providers to actually have sensible policies to manage any inherent tension in what they're delivering?
My old friend is absolutely right. I will come on to perhaps some of the guidance in a few minutes. But I did want to put on record that some of this misinterpretation of what goes on in prisons simply does not occur. The rules were changed, I think, 3 years ago. And for reference, I refer to colleagues to the answer given in the last Women and Equalities questions by my honourable friend for Suffolk. We're not sure which one in Suffolk it was. Which minister, I should say. But in terms of going back to that particular point about disorder, we're taking steps to amend a specific reference in the Act via a remedial order as soon as possible. Because in my view, trans people deserve to have the dignity of being known as their true selves, which for some will include a very personal decision of accessing a robust legal gender recognition certificate system. It's important to remember that changing legal sex is only one part of the picture. Trans people can and do go about their daily lives as their true selves, including with documents that match their required gender without needing to apply for a GRC. For some, a GRC will be a necessary next step, if they wish to get married in their required gender, for example. But this won't be the route for everyone, and we often get caught up on focusing on the Gender Recognition Act. And on the subject of the GRA, the 2018 consultation was extensive. It did receive over 100,000 responses, and we did look carefully at all of the issues raised in the consultation. But it remains the government's view now, as in September 2020, when we formally responded to the consultation, that the balance struck in this legislation is correct. The system provides proper checks and balances while also supporting people who want to change their legal sex. The system is sound, the system is robust, it works in a balanced way for all parties. That doesn't mean, as I said at the outset of my speech, that doesn't mean we can't work on ensuring the process and all the issues that many members have raised can't be addressed and resolved. But that doesn't mean, as I've just said, we're not working to make things better. The system can be streamlined to make it more straightforward, and that's why I know people have poked fun about the cost being reduced, but that was an important step. But that's something we were able to do quickly because it didn't require primary legislation. Members commented about the digitisation process and all the feedback that we've had from the beta testing, that's where it is, it's in the beta testing phase, is that the process is much more improved, and those who have used it have found it more straightforward and have found it a more straightforward and helpful process. Now, I've also accepted the views of members about the intrusive nature of the information that might have to be required for a panel, and I will take away and have a look at exactly what has to be provided to see if that is still relevant, because like many things in government, we tend to bolt things on, we rarely actually take things away. And so perhaps it's time to actually look and see if what we're asking for is still relevant today. And so I did want to mention one of the points that numerous members have commented on, which is the spousal veto. Now, we will be addressing many of the issues being raised today in the formal response to the Women and Equalities Committee report, and that response will be published shortly. But I understand that the Divorce, Dissolution and Separation Act 2020, which is about to be enacted imminently, will remove what is known as spousal veto. And I'm sure that if I've got that wrong, officials will very quickly give me a kicking. If I could turn to... no kicking so far? No? Good. Okay. Sorry. If I could turn on to single-sex spaces, I do want to assure colleagues that we will not be changing the Equality Act. For many years, trans people have used single-sex spaces in their gender without issue. The government has no interest in curtailing this. It's also important that we maintain existing provisions that allow organisations to provide single-sex spaces. And the Equality Act already allows service providers to restrict access to services on the basis of sex and gender reassignment where this is justified. Now, there's been a lot of media attention on the Equality and Human Rights Commission and their work to provide clarity to service providers on the provision of single-sex services, something that has long been called for. And I think, actually, my friend for Carshalton Wallington did say that perhaps there is a time to ensure there is more clarity in terms of what the Act allows. And I have spoken to the chair of the EHCR, and we have had a fruitful, if frank, conversation about that the Equality Act is not something that we are seeking to change, whilst recognising that some people, and many people have said it today, that clarity on the provisions of the Equality Act might be welcomed. But of course, the EHRC is of course independent from government, and that independence itself is provided under the Equality Act of 2006. But I am happy to reiterate our commitment to maintaining the existing provisions in the Equality Act of 2010. If I could just turn, Sir Christopher, onto some slightly wider issues that impact the LGBT community. Trans lives are not just impacted by legal recognition. And I know from conversations with trans people and organisations that more needs to be done to improve their health and their safety. And since I took up this role, I've gone out of my way to engage with stakeholders in the trans community. And I saw for myself when I visited Clinic Q, where I met service users and the dedicated staff and volunteers, exactly the level of support that is needed and provided by the team, the amazing team of clinicians, but also the volunteers. But it was important, and I think numerous members have said, you know, in this room, as far as I'm aware, no one is a trans person. So therefore, we can't speak from personal experience. And therefore, I took it as important in my role to ensure that I heard from trans people themselves. But I also wanted to ensure, I wanted to put something on record, that my personal commitment that the conversion therapy proposals, and I realise we may have some differences to come on particular provisions, but my commitment is the conversion therapy bill will include protecting the trans community. My also, of course, just popped in.
He mentioned that there are no trans members of Parliament, which is absolutely the case. And I think it's great that we're having this debate today and raising the issues. There are children of MPs who are trans and also non-binary. So I want to make that point to make sure that they are heard and that people feel that they are confident and feel that they have the support of this Parliament. I
really appreciate that the Honourable Lady wasn't here for the bulk of the debate. But I am very conscious that members have trans children and trans siblings. And I know from my own experience in the equal marriage debate, what changed the whole tone of the debate was when members of Parliament stood up in the chamber and talked about their personal experiences as a gay or lesbian man or woman unable to get married. But that's a very personal decision for a member to stand up and talk about their personal life. Some people are comfortable doing it, some people aren't. And so whilst I firmly recognise many members of staff, House officials, will have trans siblings and children, it has to be their decision whether they come forward to help change that debate. I urge them to. I would love them to, because it will change the whole tone of the debate when you can actually visualise, personalise, rather than some abstract policy of what a trans person might be. But that has to be a very personal decision. But I would say that also, I accept all the criticisms that I've heard today, that we haven't always got the tone right. That's absolutely true. And I'm sorry if I may get a thick ear from some of my ministerial colleagues. But I think it's true to say we haven't always got the tone right. This is sometimes an emotive issue where we sometimes can get it wrong. But I can tell you that the Secretary of State is absolutely committed to ensuring that the issues of trans rights are firmly embedded in our programme. And that's why we have not just myself joining the team, but also Lord Herbert of South Downs and Ian Anderson as the LGBT business advisor. But also, I have to say, an amazing addition to the work we do is the addition of Dr. Michael Brady as a national advisor on LGBT health. If anyone has any doubt as to what we need to do, spend time with Dr. Brady and go down to the clinics that he works in, because the work he does with his team really is truly amazing. And if anybody has any doubts, any fears, any worries about what the trans community are, then go and see for yourselves and talk to Dr. Brady and his team. Of course.
I'm slightly tangentially bringing him back to a point that he made, where he said that they would remove the gender dysphoria language. I just wonder if he could give a bit more explanation, based on the advice that he's getting from Dr. Brady and others, about what they'll replace it with concretely. You know, kind of, is it that it will just be a different word that you're suggesting, or is it that it will be a slightly different process that trans people will need to go through with their doctors? And will it only be specialists, or will there be an ability to go to general practitioners, etc.? That, I think, might provide some movement that would be welcome.
The Honourable Gentleman asked quite a complex question, and so I don't, as you'd expect, have the answer, but I will write to him. I can say that the word disorder will be removed. Exactly what it will be replaced with and how it will be implemented, I will write to him to give him a full answer. If I could, Sir Christopher, I wanted to just mention the issue about some of the process we've talked about, and on trans health, progress is being made on adult gender identity services. 5 pilots in a variety of settings have been developed, and these will be evaluated to give insight on improving delivery. As I said at the outset, that people have to wait 3 to 5 years to access services is simply unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring that the whole client, patient, whatever term we want to use, process is made faster and streamlined and more effective and client-led, of course.
Just a quick question on this. In Scotland, we've committed to bringing the gender identity healthcare into line with national waiting time standards and putting in national waiting time standards in place for that. Will the Minister consider looking at that? I know it's not slightly outside his remit. Will he consider looking at bringing in actual waiting time standards for healthcare here?
Sir Christopher, I'm in the enviable position that I can promise lots because I don't actually deliver it, because I'm not the Health Minister. But I can give that commitment that all the conversations I've had with my colleagues across government to deliver all of the changes in the bits of government and processes that impact LGBT people, that is very firmly on my agenda, and I'll take away that specific request and discuss with my colleagues in the Ministry of Health. And if I could, Sir Christopher, just want to touch on something about the under-18s, because I do believe, and this is often an area where people have the most concern perhaps, but I do want to stress that it's the government's view that the under-18s are properly supported in line with their age and decision-making capabilities. And that's why Dr. Hilary Cass is leading an independent review into gender identity services for children and young people. And we will receive the interim recommendations soon, and I've met with Dr. Cass and her team to discuss their work, which is clearly and rightly independent of government. And so I do believe that many of the concerns that members have, the public have, about services for under-18s, which are very firmly an NHS responsibility, will be addressed by the interim report by Dr. Cass. Of course.
I wonder if it's of the Minister's opinion that older teenagers, but under 18, have capacity themselves in these regards to help guide their own pathways through, just like is understandable with Gillett responsibility?
I think that the decision-making rules of under-18s will remain as they are, and that decision-making has to be informed by both the client and the clinician and the wider support framework. But it has to be where all parties have a voice. If I could conclude, Sir Christopher, I do think that discussion around the previous consultation has been quite rightly intense, and also that the issues raised today are fraught and will, I think the Rajmal Shadow Minister has called it Gordonian knot, and I do think that we will have to struggle to address some of those. But I also share the views she expressed that we agree on many, many issues. And I think with a lot of goodwill, we can address many of these issues that have been raised today and this is where we have to remember who we are doing this for, to ensure that the trans community are supported. And I just supported with, and I hate the word kindness, it sounds patronising, but in terms of supporting the trans community as they go through what is an incredibly difficult process.
I'm grateful for the Minister giving way, especially so late in his speech. I was just wondering if he could just briefly mention about non-binary people, because it is a particular part of this debate that's been discussed so far, but often non-binary people are erased from the debate by virtue of being forgotten about. I was wondering if the Minister could just remember them in his final words in this debate.
I'm aware of the issue, and it's something that I'm working on with officials, but I can't give many specific commitments today. But I can, if you like, give a commitment to the House that I and the team are committed to ensuring that LGBT people can live their lives safe and free as they wish, with respect, with dignity, and I intend to do all I can to address all of those issues that are currently making that process or their lives difficult, cumbersome or bureaucratic. These are emotive issues, and I wish to thank all colleagues for their contributions today. And although it is a debate that sometimes generates more heat than light, I think that the way that this debate has been conducted today, Sir Christopher, has actually proved that we can actually put our minds together and address some very difficult issues.
Elliot Colburn to wind up.
Thank you, Sir Christopher. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Could I join with the Minister in thanking colleagues across the House and on both sides of this discussion for their participation today, particularly for having the bravery to come to this chamber to speak on this topic, because I think I would be very, very shocked, and I'm prepared to bet with any member in this room or outside of it, that every single person who has contributed today will receive abuse on either side, which is appalling and is a shame. But I think I have to agree with the Minister as well that we have managed to conduct ourselves today better, frankly, than I expected. There was a lot of fear when... It's true. There was a lot of fear, as I said at the beginning of my remarks in my opening speech, that when the Petitions Committee were presented with this petition and were tasked with scheduling it for debate, the look of fear on colleagues' face around that room as we were deciding who would take this forward was genuine. It was real and genuine, and I don't make light of that, but I'm glad that we've managed to come to this position to have this conversation. Can I also particularly welcome the fact that it is this Minister who is in his place? I don't doubt his personal commitment to this issue one iota. I think he has spoken incredibly well, and I really do feel that with this Minister is someone that we can have real and genuine conversations on both sides and with whom we are sure our voices will be heard. So I'm very grateful to the fact that the Minister has come here today to respond to this debate. I was also really interested to hear that the government is indeed intending to remove the word gender dysphoria from the requirement. Now, I know the Minister couldn't give any more dysphoria, sorry, from the Act. I appreciate he can't give any more detail here, but I'm sure, as he knows, the Right Honourable Member for Romsey and Southampton North, the chair of the Women and Equalities Select Committee, as well as I do, that he will definitely be asked to come back to the committee to give more details on that. He also mentioned that the spousal veto will be removed in the divorce bill. Well, that just leaves living an acquired gender for 2 years as the last bit, if you like, of the equation. So it sounds as if the government is already moving in the direction that the petitioners are asking for. Now, I know, of course, that we will want to flash out some more detail in this within the Women and Equalities Committee and at Women and Equalities Questions. But if the government already is minded to remove gender dysphoria and the spousal veto, that just leaves living an acquired gender for 2 years. So I'm sure we'll look forward to having... I will happily give way. Disorder. Thank you for that clarification. Well, I will look forward to having more discussions with the Minister on that in the Women and Equalities Select Committee. But Can I just end my remarks by reiterating what everyone has said throughout the course of the debate, that at heart of this, and what we have to remember, is people. People who are just trying to live their everyday lives. And if we can conduct ourselves with the respect and tolerance that we are showing to each other in this room today, I think we can successfully take the heat out of this debate. And we can have those discussions with one another, and we can find those answers, because they are there. And they are fixable. So I'm sure that this will be the first of many, many conversations that we have. Can I thank all members again for coming along to this debate? It's one of the most well-attended Petitions Committee debates that I have taken part in, and indeed gives us faith in the petition system. So thank you to members for doing that. But on that basis, Sir Christopher, with a minute and a half left, I beg to move.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 327108 relating to reform of the Gender Recognition Act. As many of them say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.